The envelope arrived with the Morning Post, an unassuming rectangle of thick, cream-colored paper that stood out starkly against the clinical order of Dr. Heinrich von Stahl's desk. It bore no return address, only the stark, official eagle and swastika insignia of the Reich, stamped in black wax. For a man whose life was a study in precision and control, the intrusion was both an affront and a promise. Heinrich's long, pale fingers, more accustomed to the cold steel of surgical instruments, picked it up with a deliberate slowness that belied the sudden sharp focus in his ice-blue eyes. He used a sterling silver letter opener, its blade slicing through the wax seal with a clean, satisfying crack. The sound echoed softly in the sterile silence of his study, a room devoid of personal mementos or sentimental clutter. There were only book treatises on anatomy, psychology, and pain management, a single, framed photograph of himself receiving his medical degree. His expression then, as unreadable as it was now. The letter inside was brief, typed on the same heavy stock. It was an order, not a request. Effective immediately, Dr. Heinrich von Stahl was to report to the commandant of the Berlin dungeon to assume full control of its operations. His noted expertise in human physiology and psychological resilience had been deemed optimal for the role. A cold smile, thin and devoid of warmth, touched his lips. This was not a punishment, it was a promotion into the innermost sanctum of state power, a laboratory of limitless potential hidden deep beneath the city's cobbled streets. He felt no trepidation, no moral unease. Those were emotions for lesser men, men who flinched at the necessary costs of progress and order. He thought of the dungeon not as a place of horror, but as a crucible. The abstract theories he had devoted his life to could be tested, refined, and perfected. The human body was a machine, the mind its faulty circuitry. Pain was not a tragedy but a tool, a precise instrument for unlocking secrets, enforcing compliance, and mapping the very limits of endurance. His ambition, a cold and voracious thing that had simmered within him for years, now had its outlet. He would not merely run the dungeon, he would master it, would transform its crude, brutish methods into a science of suffering, and in doing so, earn the gratitude and fear of the regime he served so utterly. Folding the letter with exacting neatness, he placed it back into its envelope. There was no need to pack. His needs were few, and his new quarters would be supplied. He rose from his chair, his movements economical and precise. He glanced once out the window at the gray Berlin morning, his reflection a pale, impassive ghost superimposed over the city. The world above was noise and chaos. But below, in the quiet, damp dark, he would create his own perfect, terrible order. The summons was not an end to his old life, but the glorious beginning of his true work. The iron door groaned on its hinges, a sound of such profound and ancient resistance that it seemed to suck the very air from the stone corridor. Heinrich von Stahl did not flinch at the noise, nor at the wave of damp frigid air that washed over him, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of mildew-stale fear and something metallic and coppery that spoke of old pain. Before him, a narrow staircase spiraled downward into absolute blackness, each worn step looking like a tooth in some monstrous stone gullet waiting to swallow him whole. This was the threshold of his new domain. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their postures rigid, their faces pale and slick with a nervous sweat that gleamed in the flickering light of the single bulb overhead. They avoided his gaze, their eyes fixed on some middle distance, seeing nothing, acknowledging nothing. Their silence was not the disciplined quiet of soldiers, but the fearful hush of men standing at the mouth of a nightmare. They were forced to guard but dreaded to enter. Heinrich noted their terror with clinical detachment. It was a data point, an indicator of the environment's psychological potency. Their fear was a weakness, an inefficiency he would soon correct. He took the first step, the heel of his polished boot, meeting the cold, damp stone with a definitive click that echoed into the abyss below. The air grew heavier with each descent, the temperature dropping until his breath began to form faint plumes in the stale atmosphere. The walls, slick with condensation, seemed to press inwards, the rough-hewn rock absorbing what little light filtered down from above. The only sounds were the measured, unwavering rhythm of his own footsteps, and the increasingly ragged breathing of the guards following a pace behind him, their own boots scraping nervously against the steps. The darkness was not empty. It was a palpable entity, thick and suffocating, filled with the ghosts of countless miseries. It pressed against his skin, a cold, wet shroud. He could feel the weight of the city above, the countless lives unfolding in ignorant sunlight. And beneath it all, this hidden abscess of despair. He did not feel oppressed by it, felt invigorated. This was pure, unadulterated potential. Every shadow held a question. Every drop of moisture falling from the ceiling was a variable in a grand, terrible experiment. It was not descending into a pit. He was entering his laboratory, and the pervasive dread was merely the baseline atmosphere of his work. The fearful silence of the guards was the perfect canvas upon which his new, precise order would be painted. The chamber unfolded before him like a gallery of forgotten arts, a macabre museum where every exhibit was designed not for observation, but for application. Rusted iron implements hung from hooks on the damp stone walls, their shapes a grim lexicon of pain-jagged hooks, serrated blades, and contraptions whose purposes were both mechanical and horrifyingly intimate. The air here was thicker, tainted with the ghost of old rust and something more organic, a scent of long-ago terror that had seeped into the very stone. Heinrich moved among them with the detached curiosity of a scholar in an archive. His gloved fingers, pale and precise, did not shy from the corroded metal. He lifted a set of thumb screws, the screws stiff with age, and turned them slowly in the dim light. His mind did not register the agony they were built to inflict, only their crude inefficiency. The mechanism was simple, the torque imprecise. The damage would be swift and blunt, a waste of potential data. He set them down and moved to a rack, its wooden frame warped by moisture, the ropes frayed and brittle. He noted the poor leverage, the lack of gradation in the wheel. It was a tool of brute force, not measured persuasion. Each instrument was a testament to a lack of imagination, a failure to understand pain as a science rather than a spectacle. A brazier stood cold in one corner, its bed filled with ancient ash, and beside it lay a set of branding irons, their ends shaped into crude runes. Heinrich picked one up, feeling its dead weight. The heat would be difficult to control, the branding imprecise, the risk of fatal sepsis unacceptably high. It was wastefulness disguised as punishment. His clinical assessment was uninterrupted by any flicker of horror. Where another man might see a history of suffering, Heinrich saw only a catalogue of errors waiting to be corrected. His mind was already alight with improvements. Place the rotten ropes with calibrated chains. Fit the thumb screws with gauges to measure pressure precisely. Redesign the rack to allow for incremental, reversible extension of the limbs. He envisioned a system where pain was not an end, but a variable, to be increased, decreased, and applied with the exactitude of a chemist measuring a reagent. He ran a finger along the edge of a rusted saw, his thoughts turning to metallurgy, to sterilization, to the acoustic properties of the chamber and how they might be modified to enhance or isolate the sounds of distress for optimal psychological effect. This was not a place of dread to him. It was a workshop in dire need of a master craftsman. The rust was not a patina of age, but a sign of neglect, and he, Heinrich von Stahl, had been summoned to end it. He would bring order to this chaos, precision to this brutality. He would make the dungeon efficient. The guards assembled in the main chamber, their postures rigid, yet their eyes betraying a deep-seated skepticism. They stood in a loose semicircle, a collection of hardened men who had long grown accustomed to the dungeon-esque grim rhythms and its former commander-esque predictable brutalities. They watched the new doctor with guarded expressions, their collective breath hanging in the cold air like a challenge. Heinrich von Stahl stood before them, a figure of chilling composure, his immaculate uniform and pale, unreadable face, a stark contrast to the grime and despair that saturated the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words, when they came, were measured, precise, and carried on a tone so devoid of emotion it seemed to lower the temperature in the chamber further. He began by dismantling their existing routines, his critique of their methods as cold and sharp as a scalpel. He spoke of wasted opportunities and unobserved data, of screams that were merely noise without proper context. The old ways, he informed them, were over. They were not butchers in an abattoir. They were technicians in a laboratory of state security. He then outlined his new protocols, his voice a flat, relentless stream of instruction that left no room for question or debate. Every aspect of their duties was to be refined. Prisoners were to be logged upon arrival with detailed physical and psychological assessments. Instruments were to be cleaned, maintained, and their use recorded with exacting notes on applied pressure, duration, and subject response. Pain was no longer to be an uncontrolled outburst, but a calibrated application, increased in precise increments to maximize both information extraction and endurance testing. Rest periods were to be timed, nourishment measured, all to maintain the subject's viability for extended study. He watched their faces as he spoke, noting the flickers of confusion, the subtle shifts of unease. They were men of action, not of observation. They understood the fist and the boot, not the gauge and the journal. Their skepticism was a variable he had anticipated, an inefficiency to be corrected. His gaze swept over them, lingering on each man just long enough to make him feel seen, assessed, and found wanting. He concluded by informing them that their performance would now be under constant review. Inefficiency would be punished. Deviation from protocol would be considered insubordination. The state demanded results, and he was the instrument of that demand. Their role was to facilitate his work with unquestioning precision. There would be no more sloppiness, no more wasted suffering. Under his command, the dungeon would achieve a level of operational perfection that would make it a model for the Reich. He finished speaking and let the silence stretch, a void into which their doubts and fears poured, only to be met with the absolute, unassailable certainty of his authority. The message was clear. Their world had just become much colder, much darker, and entirely his. The heavy iron door groaned open, admitting not just a prisoner, but a pocket of the world above, a faint scent of cold night air and cheap tobacco clinging to the man's worn coat. Franz Weber was pushed forward into the chamber, his hands bound, his posture defiant, even as his eyes, wide and darting, betrayed the primal fear that the dungeon's atmosphere provoked in all who entered it. He was a printer by trade, his fingers stained with ink, his mind filled with the dangerous words he had set to type. Now he stood in the stark, lamplit circle of Heinrich von Stahl's domain. Heinrich did not rise from his austere chair. He merely observed the man's entrance, his gaze as clinical and assessing as it had been when surveying the rusted instruments on the walls. He noted the rapid pulse visible in the prisoner's throat, the slight tremor in his bound hands, the way his eyes refused to settle, searching for an exit that did not exist. This was not a man to be broken with a single blow. His defiance was a structure, and Heinrich was an architect of collapse. He would not simply tear it down, would study the process of its dismantling, brick by psychological brick. He gestured for the guards to step back, leaving Franz standing alone in the center of the room, isolated under the unforgiving light. Heinrich's voice, when he finally spoke, was not the expected roar of a torturer. It was a calm, almost conversational monotone, devoid of malice or urgency, which was in itself a form of terror. He began to explain the process, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, like a physician outlining a course of treatment. He spoke of phases and stages of initial resistance and eventual cooperation, of the body's limitations and the mind's surprising capacity to betray its own principles. He described the instruments that lined the walls not as tools of punishment, but as means of measurement devices to quantify pain, to map thresholds, to gather data on human endurance. He explained how isolation would first amplify fear, how uncertainty would erode resolve, and how the careful incremental application of discomfort would rewire the prisoner's own priorities, making the truth not a matter of loyalty, but a commodity to be traded for a moment's respite. It was a chillingly rational forecast of suffering, delivered with the dispassionate certainty of a weather report predicting a storm. He was not describing what he might do. He was describing what would inevitably happen, a fate already written in the cold, damp air of the chamber. Franz Weber listened, his initial defiance slowly leaching away, replaced by the dawning, horrifying understanding that he was not facing a man, but a process-a machine of pain that had already begun its inexorable work. Heinrich began, not with violence, but with silence. He ordered the guards to withdraw, leaving Franz Weber alone in the cold, lamplit chamber. The heavy door ceiling shut with a sound like a tomb being closed. The sudden absence of other presences was itself a form of pressure, a vacuum into which the prisoner's own fears rushed to fill the void. Heinrich observed, from a shadowed corner, a specter in his own domain. Noting the way Franz's breathing shallowed, how his eyes widened at every drip of water from the damp ceiling. How his bound hands clenched and unclenched against the unnatural quiet. Time became the first instrument. Heinrich let minutes stretch into what felt like hours, allowing the man's imagination to work upon itself. In the utter stillness, every small sound, the scuttle of a rat in the walls, the distant muffled cry from another part of the dungeon, became a portent of horrors to come. Franz began to shiver, though the cold was not yet severe. It was the chill of anticipation, of dread given free rein in the absence of any distraction. Heinrich noted the physiological responses with detached interest, the increased heart rate, the sweat beating on the brow despite the cool air. The mind was torturing itself far more efficiently than any crude tool could at this initial stage. Then Heinrich began to speak again, his voice a soft, relentless murmur from the darkness. He did not shout accusations or demand answers. Instead, he recited known details of Franz's life, the name of his wife, the street where he lived, the ages of his children, not as threats, but as simple, irrefutable facts. He spoke of the vulnerability of those left behind, of the fragility of a family without its protector, painting vivid, unspoken pictures of loss and desolation that were far more potent than any direct menace. He was exploiting the love Franz felt, turning it into a weapon against him, making his devotion the very source of his torment. He watched as the man's defiance, so palpable upon his arrival, began to crumble at the edges. The proud set of his shoulders slumped. His gaze, which had once scanned for escape, now dropped to the filthy floor, as if seeking refuge in its solidity. The psychological isolation was complete. Franz was utterly alone with his fears, with the calm, omniscient voice that knew his every weakness. Heinrich saw the precise moment when the man's spirit began to fracture, not from pain inflicted, but from the terror of what was to come and the agonizing powerlessness to prevent it. The foundation was laid, the body was still whole, but the mind was already beginning to break. Now, and only now, was it time to introduce the physical component to the equation. Heinrich led the guards to the far end of the chamber, where his first major modification stood waiting under a heavy canvas shroud. With a sharp, precise motion, he pulled the covering away, revealing the rack. It was not the warped, crude instrument of the previous tour. This was a thing of chilling, mechanical elegance. The old, rotten timber had been replaced with polished, reinforced oak, dark and gleaming under the lamplight. The frayed ropes were gone, supplanted by a system of leather-padded cuffs connected to a central windlass via a series of calibrated iron gears and chains that shone with a light coat of oil. He gestured for the guards to bring forth a prisoner, a man already broken by previous sessions. His eyes hollow, his movements sluggish with despair. They strapped him onto the device without resistance, the new cuffs closing with soft, definitive clicks. Heinrich approached, his fingers tracing the mechanism with something akin to reverence. He explained its function not as a tool for breaking, but for measuring. The large spoked wheel was fitted with a graduated dial, each increment marked with meticulous precision. A single turn would apply a measurable, repeatable amount of tension. He began to turn the wheel, the gears engaging with a smooth, almost silent meshing of metal. The chains tightened infinitesimally. The prisoner on the table gasped, a short, sharp intake of breath, as the tension mounted in his joints. Heinrich paused, his eyes fixed not on the man's contorted face, but on the dial. He noted the exact point of the first vocalization, the first visible tremor in the limbs. This was the baseline, the threshold of meaningful discomfort. He emphasized to the watching guards the critical importance of this incremental approach. Brutal, rapid force was wasteful. It risked permanent damage, unconsciousness, or death, terminating the session and destroying the subject's utility. True mastery, he explained in his flat, pedagogical tone, lay in the slow, inexorable increase of strain. It allowed the subject's mind to fully comprehend each new level of agony, to anticipate the next, and to despair at its inevitability. It transformed pain from an event into a landscape, a terrible country through which the prisoner was forced to travel. With Heinrich as the unchallenged cartographer of its every hill and valley, he demonstrated turning the wheel another precise quarter turn. A low moan escaped the prisoner's lips, his back arching slightly against the unyielding wood. Heinrich pointed out the subtle shift in muscle tension, the change in respiratory pattern. Each reaction was a data point, a piece of the puzzle of this particular man's endurance. He spoke of ligaments and tendons, of the precise points of failure within the human frame, and how to approach them without crossing the line into irreparable damage. The goal was not to tear the man apart, but to stretch him to the very brink of his structural integrity. To hold him there, and to make him understand that his continued existence depended entirely on the doctor's will and the measured turn of a wheel. It was a lesson in controlled, calculated agony, and the guards watched. Their earlier skepticism now frozen into a new, deeper kind of fear. They were not just witnessing torture, they were witnessing its evolution into a cold, exact science. The new doctor's presence seeped through the dungeon like a slow, cold poison, its tendrils finding their way into every damp crevice and despairing cell. In the oppressive dark, where sound carried with unnatural clarity, the prisoners began to speak. Not in shouts or pleas, but in hushed, frantic whispers that slithered along the wet stone, passing from one barred window to the next, a clandestine network of terror. They spoke of the man who had come from above, the one who moved with the silence of a shadow, and whose eyes held no more warmth than the polished steel of his instruments. The rumors began with the guards, whose own fear had become a palpable thing. Their footsteps, once heavy with bored authority, now carried a new, nervous haste. In the rare moments they spoke to each other, their voices were low, edged with a tension the prisoners had never heard before. Fragments of conversations were caught and magnified in the echoing hall's words like calibrated, incremental. The threshold were passed along, their clinical coldness somehow more frightening than any threat of violence. They spoke of the doctor's quiet voice, his endless note-taking, and the way he looked at a screaming man not with cruelty, but with the focused interest of a scholar examining a rare specimen. The story of Franz Weber spread fastest of all. He had been a defiant man, his spirit a small, stubborn flame in the overwhelming dark. Then he had been taken to the new doctor's chamber. When he was returned to his cell, he was a hollowed-out shell. He did not speak of beatings or brands. He spoke of silence, of a voice that knew his children's names, of a dread that grew not from what was done, but from what was promised. He whimpered about a machine that measured pain, turning a wheel that stretched agony into an endless, calculable horizon. His broken testimony, passed from lip to ear, became the foundational text of a new and rising horror. The whispers built upon each other, layering fear upon fear. He said the doctor never raised his voice, that he could strip a man's courage away with words alone before a single tool was touched. They said he had rebuilt the ancient devices, not to be more brutal, but to be more precise, to make suffering last longer and cut deeper into the mind. The darkness of the dungeon, once a blanket of shared misery, now felt like it was watching, listening, filled with the doctor's invisible, analytical gaze. Every creak of a door, every footstep on the stone, sent a fresh wave of paralyzing dread through the cells. The prisoners huddled in the perpetual chill, their world shrinking to the sound of their own heartbeats and the terrifying whispers in the walls that spoke of a terror they had no name for, a master of pain who had come to turn their suffering into a science. The heavy oak door to his private quarters closed with a soft, definitive click, sealing Heinrich von Stahl away from the echoing dread of the dungeon. Here, in his study, a different kind of silence reigned, one of order, control, and chilling intellect. The room was a stark contrast to the dripping chaos outside. A single powerful lamp cast a pool of bright, sterile light onto a vast, polished desk, its surface bare except for a fresh journal bound in black. Leather, a bottle of dark ink, and a row of pens aligned with military precision. Bookshelves lined the walls, not with literature or philosophy, but with dense volumes on neurology, trauma response, and the physics of structural failure in biological systems. Heinrich sat, his posture unnervingly erect, and opened the journal. The first page was blank. He dipped his pen, the nib scratching against the paper, in the absolute quiet, a sound as measured and deliberate as his every action. He began not with a date or a personal reflection, but with a heading, Subject FW. Initial Observations. His script was flawless, each letter a tiny monument to control. He chronicled the interrogation of Franz Weber with the dispassionate detail of a lab report. He noted the subject's baseline physiological responses, heart rate, respiratory patterns, pupillary dilation upon entry into the chamber. He described the efficacy of the initial period of sensory deprivation, quantifying the approximate time it took for observable anxiety to manifest into tangible fear. The application of psychological pressure, specifically the strategic mention of familial attachments, was logged as the primary catalyst for the subject's first significant drop in resistance. He did not write of screams or tears. He recorded vocalization frequencies and lacrimation levels. He made sketches in the margins not of a man in agony, but of stress vectors applied to joints, diagrams of the rack's gear ratios, and calculations regarding tensile strength versus applied torque. He noted the exact dial reading at which the subject's left shoulder ligament first exhibited audible strain, and the subsequent point where coherent speech devolved into involuntary pleading. This was not a record of suffering. It was a collection of data points, a map of a human breaking point. A faint, cold smile touched his lips as he wrote, an expression of pure intellectual satisfaction. The chaos of human emotion, the messy, unpredictable terror of his subjects, was being filtered through his pen into clean, objective facts. He was not a torturer. He was a pioneer. Each session in the chambers below was an experiment, and this journal was his log of discoveries. He was decoding the language of pain, syllable by agonized syllable, and in these quiet, ordered hours surrounded by his books, he felt a sense of purpose so profound it bordered on reverence. He was not inflicting horror. He was conducting a grand, terrible symphony of suffering, and he was its meticulous, devoted composer. The guards brought her in not with the usual shove of contempt, but with a wary, almost reluctant respect, their hands careful on her arms, as if fearing she might turn and bite. Lisa Vogt stood in the center of the chamber, her posture not slumped in defeat but coiled with a defiant energy that seemed to charge the dank air. She was taller than most of the women who found their way down here, her frame lean and hardened by something more than deprivation by purpose. Her clothes were rough and stained, but they hung on her with a functional dignity. A dark bruise bloomed across her cheekbone, a trophy from her capture, but it did nothing to diminish the fierce clarity in her eyes. Heinrich, who had been reviewing a logbook, looked up slowly. The usual procession of broken souls had become a predictable monotony, a series of similar reactions to be catalogued and cross-referenced. This was different. He dismissed the guards with a slight gesture, his attention fully captured. He watched her as the door closed, noting the details that set her apart. She did not glance around the chamber at the instruments with wide-eyed terror. Her gaze swept the room once, assessing, calculating, before settling on him with an unnerving directness. There was no fear in that look, only a cold, simmering hatred and an unshakable certainty. Hey. She did not wait for him to speak. She straightened her shoulders, a small, deliberate motion that was itself an act of rebellion in this place, designed to crush the spirit. Her hands bound before her were not clenched in panic, but held loosely ready. She met his clinical gaze and held it, her chin lifted. Her expression one of utter contempt. It was a look that acknowledged his power, his control over her physical being, and dismissed it as irrelevant. In her eyes, he was not a master of this domain. He was merely a symptom of the disease she had fought against. A strange, unfamiliar sensation stirred within Heinrich, something beyond clinical interest. It was not admiration, for he admired nothing but efficiency and control. It was intrigue, a sharp intellectual curiosity that felt almost like a challenge. Here was a variable his equations had not accounted for. Her defiance was not the bluster of a frightened man trying to summon courage. It was a core part of her architecture, a foundation that seemed, for the first time, potentially unbreachable. The whispers in the walls had spoken of Hertha Prinner's daughter, the pamphleteer, the woman who had eluded capture for months by being smarter, braver than her pursuers. They had not done her justice. She was not just a resistance fighter. She was a phenomenon. And Heinrich von Stahl, the master of measurable pain, found himself fascinated by something he could not yet quantify. The first stage was silence and darkness. Heinrich had her moved to a special cell, a black cube carved from the dungeon's oldest stone, where sound died upon entry and light was a forgotten concept. The door sealed her in with a finality that was absolute. For the first few hours, there was nothing but the hammering of her own heart and the slow measured drip of water from a crack in the ceiling. The sound he had, engineered to fall at irregular intervals, disrupting any attempt by the mind to find rhythm or pattern. He observed through a narrow slit, his presence undetectable in the void, his notepad ready. He timed her breathing, her occasional shifts in the blackness. The first tentative whispers she uttered to herself, mantras of defiance that grew fainter with each passing cycle of the unseen drip. When the silence had stretched her nerves to a thin wire, he introduced sound. Not the screams of other prisoners, which might have offered a perverse camaraderie, but a low, dissonant hum from a hidden speaker. It was a frequency designed to vibrate in the teeth and skull, a sound that was felt more than heard, a constant grating pressure on the edge of perception. It offered no meaning, no variation, only a relentless auditory assault that made thought itself a struggle. He watched as she pressed her hands over her ears, a futile gesture against the vibration within her own bones. Her defiant posture, so evident upon her arrival, began to erode into a slow, continuous rachina, primitive, self-soothing behavior he noted with keen interest. Next came the light. After an eternity of blackness, a single, blindingly bright electric bulb flicked on directly above her, its glare reflecting off the wet walls with painful intensity. It remained lit for precisely 10 minutes, long enough for her eyes to begin to adjust and cling to the relief of vision, before it snapped off again, plunging her back into the utter dark. The cycle repeated at random intervals: 5 minutes of light, 20 of dark, 2 minutes of light, an hour of dark. Her circadian rhythms shattered. She lost all sense of night and day, of time itself. Her world contracted to the agonizing anticipation of the light's return and the deeper despair of its departure. He monitored her ceaselessly, a scientist observing a subject in a carefully controlled environment. He charted the decline of her focus, the way her eyes lost their sharp clarity and became unfocused, haunted. He noted the tremors that started in her hands and spread through her body, the involuntary twitches of sleep-deprived muscles, desperate for a reprieve that would not come. The defiant set of her jaws softened into a slackness of exhaustion. She began to mumble not words of resistance, but fragmented, disjointed phrases, childhood memories, snippets of song, pleas to people who were not there. Her mind, the very fortress he had been so intrigued by, was turning in on itself, its walls crumbling under the relentless, senseless siege. Heinrich recorded every detail, every data point of her unraveling, his fascination growing with each sign of fracture. He was not just breaking her. He was meticulously mapping the beautiful, terrible architecture of her breaking point. The guards assembled in the main chamber, their ranks swelled by a half-dozen new recruits, whose faces were still soft with the outside world, their eyes wide with a mixture of bravado and poorly concealed dread. They stood at attention, trying to emulate the stony impassivity of the veterans. But their nervous glances at the heavy canvas shroud in the center of the room betrayed them. Heinrich von Stahl stood before the covered object, his presence a cold anchor in the tense atmosphere. He did not address them immediately, letting the silence and their own imaginations work upon them first. With a theatrical flourish that was utterly unlike his usual clinical precision, he grasped the edge of the canvas and pulled. The heavy cloth slid away to reveal the restored Iron Maiden. It was a masterpiece of horrific artistry, towering over them like a pagan idol. The outer shell, once pitted and rusted, now gleamed with a coat of black lacquer, making the raised patterns of Fogothic arches and demonic faces seem to writhe in the torchlight. The famous double doors were slightly ajar, offering a terrifying glimpse of the interior upon row of long, sharp iron spikes, their points honed to a wicked gleam. Waiting within the dark cavity, a collective, barely audible gasp rippled through the new guards. One of them took an involuntary step backward, his boot scraping loudly on the stone. Heinrich's ice-blue eyes flicked toward the sound, noting the man's identity for later correction. This was not a tool for their fear. It was a tool for their education. He did not speak of the maiden's history or its legendary reputation. Instead, he spoke of its mechanics, his voice a dispassionate lecture. He explained the precision of the hinge mechanism, the counterweight that allowed the doors to be closed with controlled, gradual pressure rather than a single slam, and the strategic placement of the spikes designed to pierce non-vital areas, avoiding immediate, fatal wounds to prolong the experience for maximum psychological and physiological data extraction. It was not an engine of death, he explained, but an instrument of exquisite, measurable agony. For the demonstration, a man was brought forward, a petty thief, sniveling and trembling, his crime insignificant, but his utility for this lesson paramount. The veteran strapped him into the dreadful contraption with practiced efficiency, ignoring his choked sobs. Heinrich positioned himself at the door, his hand resting on the handle. He looked over the assembled guards, his gaze lingering on each new face. Then, with agonizing slowness, he began to push the door closed. The mechanism gave a soft, oiled sigh. The spikes did not impale. They began to press, their needle points dimpling the man's skin, promising the penetration to come. The thief's whimpers escalated into a high, keening wail of pure anticipatory terror. Heinrich paused, the door held just at the threshold of piercing. He held it there, letting the man's screams and the awful, imminent promise of the spikes fill the chamber, a more potent lesson than any bloodshed could provide. He was demonstrating not the act of torture, but its essence, the masterful control of terror itself. The new guards stood frozen, their earlier bravado utterly incinerated in the face of this cold, calculated theater of pain. They understood now. They were not in a dungeon. They were in the doctor's laboratory, and they were merely his assistants. Klaus could not scrub the scent of rust and old terror from his skin. It clung to his uniform, a phantom odor that seemed to seep from his very pores, a constant reminder of the stone labyrinth that had become his world. Each shift was a descent into a colder, more precise kind of hell, one governed not by rage, but by a chilling, dispassionate logic that he found more unnerving than any brute's cruelty. The screams had become a monotonous background hum, the sight of broken men a daily tableau. But it was the doctor's calm, analytical presence that truly scraped at his soul. The breaking point came after the demonstration with the Iron Maiden, image of the thief's face, contorted in a silent scream of pure anticipated agony, played behind Klaus's eyelids every time he blinked. He found himself in the small, grimy antechamber where the guards took their scant breaks, his hands trembling so violently he could barely light a cigarette. He was young, his conscience not yet calloused into oblivion, and the weight of his complicity felt like a physical chain around his neck. He looked at the veteran guards, their faces carved from stone, and a desperate, reckless need for reassurance overcame him. He found his moment as Dr. von Stahl was leaving his study, the black journal tucked under his arm. Klaus stepped forward, his voice a strained, husky thing that barely carried in the damp corridor. He spoke of efficiency, of duty, wrapping his unease in the language he thought the doctor would understand. But beneath the clumsy words was a raw, bleeding truth. He spoke of sleepless nights, of the faces of the men they broke, of the cold that was settling not in the dungeon's stones, but in his own heart, he asked, his voice cracking on the final word, if this was truly the only way. Heinrich von Stahl stopped and turned. He did not look angry or dismissive. He looked interested. His pale eyes focused on Klaus with the same detached curiosity he reserved for a novel reaction in a test subject. He took a step closer, and the air around them seemed to grow colder. He did not respond to the young guard's moral quandary. He did not speak of orders or the greater good. Instead, his voice dropped to a soft, almost intimate monotone that was far more terrifying than any shout. He asked Klaus if he remembered his sister Greta, who worked at the bakery on Rosenstrage. He described the little blue flowers on her favorite dress. He mentioned his mother's chronic cough, the one that kept her awake at night in their small apartment on the 3rd floor. He knew their routines, their vulnerabilities, the precise route Klaus took to visit them on his rare days of leave. The threat was not voiced in a snarl. It was woven into a tapestry of intimate, terrifying knowledge. The message was crystalline and absolute. Klaus's doubt was not a philosophical concern. It was a tangible danger to the only people in the world he loved. His loyalty was no longer a matter of patriotism or duty. It was a ransom payment for their safety. The blood drained from Klaus's face, leaving him as pale as the dungeon's mortar. The last flicker of defiance in his eyes guttered and died, extinguished by the cold, precise pressure of the doctor's will. He stood utterly still, a statue of fear, as Heinrich gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod and continued on his way. The echo of his polished boots on the stone, the only sound in the suddenly suffocating silence. The lesson was over. The doubt had been excised. All that remained was perfect, terrified obedience. The bucket, the cloth, the inclined board, these were the simple, almost mundane components of Heinrich's latest refinement. But in his hands they were transformed into an instrument of exquisite scientific terror. He had dismissed the crude, haphazard versions of the practice he had observed upon his arrival, where guards simply poured water with brutal indifference. That was waste. That was noise. He sought not drowning, but the precise, repeatable simulation of it, a controlled variable in his grand experiment of human limits. He oversaw the construction of a new apparatus himself. The board was set at a precise 15-degree angle, ensuring the subject's head was lower than their feet to facilitate the desired physiological response. Restraints were not ropes, but padded leather cuffs, adjustable to accommodate different body sizes without causing distracting secondary pain. The bucket was replaced with a large enameled pitcher, its lip designed for a smooth, controllable pour. The cloth was a specific grade of linen, porous enough to allow the slow seepage of water, yet thick enough to form an effective seal over the nose and mouth. His first subject was a man whose spirit had already been largely extinguished by previous sessions, making him an ideal baseline for calibration. Heinrich positioned him on the board with the detached efficiency of a surgeon prepping for operation. He placed the linen cloth over the man's face, smoothing it down until it adhered to the skin with a damp kiss. He then picked up the pitcher, his movements slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. He began the pour, a thin, steady stream of cold water. The man's body, which had lain limp, immediately tensed. His chest heaved in a violent, involuntary spasm as the water saturated the cloth and flooded his airways. The primal panic of suffocation, a reflex hardwired into the most ancient parts of the brain, took absolute control. His back arched against the restraints, his hands clawed at empty air. Heinrich watched, his head tilted, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the time from the initial pour to the first violent bodily reaction, 3 seconds. He noted the specific muscle groups that contracted first, the diaphragm, the intercostals. After 10 seconds, he lifted the pitcher. The cloth was removed. The man gasped, coughing and sputtering, drawing in great ragged lungfuls of air, his body shuddering with the shock of reprieve. The terror in his eyes was absolute, a raw animal thing. Heinrich did not look at the terror. He looked at the clock. He timed the recovery period, the span it took for the heart rate to descend from its frantic peak to a merely elevated state. He jotted notes in his journal, his script unwavering. Asterisk subject exhibits classic mammalian diving reflex, laryngospasm noted. Oxygen deprivation effects manifesting in pupil dilation and disorientation. Asterisk. He repeated the process. Pour. 10 seconds of drowning. Stop. Recovery. Each cycle was identical in duration, a metronome of agony, but the effects were cumulative. With each repetition, the subject's resistance waned. The precious seconds of air between torments were not enough for the body to reset. The carbon dioxide levels in the blood built up, the acidose deepening the sense of panic and impending doom. The mind, starved of oxygen and assaulted by relentless waves of primal fear, began to unravel far more quickly than under any physical torment. Heinrich filled page after page with observations. He was not just inflicting horror. He was charting the topography of the drowning reflex, mapping the exact parameters where the body's will to live became its own most exquisite torture. He had taken a brutish practice and refined it into a chillingly precise science, a way to break a man not with pain, but with the elemental. Terrifying promise of his own breath being stolen away, again and again and again. The man on the board had long since passed the point of coherent struggle. His body, once taut with panic, now moved in a series of weak, fluttering spasms, like a fish gasping on a riverbank. The linen cloth, soaked through and clinging to his face, molded itself to the desperate open O of his mouth with each futile attempt to draw a breath that wasn't there. The cycles had blurred into one continuous tide of suffocation. The brief moments of air too short to clear the fog of carbon dioxide building in his blood, too fleeting to offer anything but a tantalizing, cruel glimpse of reprieve before the next deluge began. Heinrich continued the pour, his arm moving with the steady, unhurried rhythm of a metronome, his eyes fixed not on the man's agony, but on the subtle physiological cues he had been tracking. The violent arching of the spine had ceased, replaced by a generalized trembling. The hands which had clawed at the air now hung limp from the restraints. The gasps between cycles had grown shallower, more ragged, punctuated by wet, choking sounds that were less voluntary and more the death rattle of a drowning mechanism pushed beyond its limits. Then, during one particularly extended pour, the trembling stopped altogether. The body went utterly still. A long, silent exhalation whispered from beneath the cloth a final surrender. The chest did not rise again. The only movement was the slow drip of water from the edge of the board onto the stone floor. Plink, plink, plink. The guard holding the man's shoulders looked up, his face pale. "Here, doctor, he's Heinrich." Lifted the pitcher, cutting off the stream of water. He did not look alarmed or rushed. He set the pitcher down with the same deliberate care he used for everything. He stepped forward and peeled the wet cloth from the man's face. The features were slack, tinged with blue, the eyes open and devoid of any light. There was no question. The subject had crossed the final threshold. A strange, intense focus settled over Heinrich. This was not a failure. It was an unexpected data point, a deviation from the predicted model that required immediate correction. Death was an unacceptable loss of research material. He barked an order, his voice sharp but still controlled, and two guards rushed to loosen the restraints. Heinrich rolled the man onto his side, delivering several sharp, percussive blows to his back, attempting to dislodge any water from the airways. There was no response. He then positioned the limp form on the floor and began a methodical, almost mechanical application of chest compressions. His movements precise and measured, as if he were operating a stubborn piece of equipment. He counted the compressions under his breath, his expression one of intense concentration, utterly divorced from the reality of trying to force life back into a broken vessel. It was a clinical procedure, a troubleshooting step. After a minute of this, the body gave a violent jerk. A gush of water spilled from the mouth, followed by a raw, sucking gasp that tore through the silent chamber. Color flooded back into the man's face, replaced almost instantly by a mask of pure, abject terror as consciousness returned, and with it, the memory of the abyss he had just left. He began to sob, a broken, hiccuping sound of utter devastation. Heinrich observed the return of respiratory function, the dilation of the pupils, the return of reflexive fear. He made a note in his journal calibrating the exact point of physiological shutdown and the efficacy of the revival technique. Then, without a word of comfort, without a moment's pause to allow the man to comprehend his own resurrection, he gestured to the guards. Again he said, his voice flat, "We will continue. Note the subject's increased sensitivity. Upon revival." The terror in the man's eyes deepened into a bottomless horror. As the guards moved to lift him back onto the board, Heinrich watched, his own obsession with control reflected in those terrified eyes, not the control to kill, but the far more terrible power to decide when death was, and was not, permitted. The experiment was not over. It had merely entered a new, more refined phase. The scent of formaldehyde and the dry, papery whisper of turning pages were the perfumes of Heinrich's youth, a world contained within the high, silent walls of his father's library and the pristine sterility of the university laboratories where he was sometimes permitted to observe. The great city of Berlin, with its noise and chaos, existed only as a distant murmur beyond the leaded glass windows, a world he observed with the same detached curiosity he applied to the specimens floating in glass jars. He was a boy of 12, pale and serious, his hands already possessing the steady, deliberate grace they would carry into adulthood. His fascination was not with life, but with its mechanics. While other boys chased balls or played at soldiers, Heinrich sought a different kind of conquest. His kingdom was the dissecting tray. His father, a professor of anatomy of cold and exacting temperament, had initially indulged the boy's morbid curiosity with the corpses of small animals, a frog, a rabbit, a stray cat brought down by a carriage on the street outside. But he soon saw something in his son that went beyond childish ghoulishness. Heinrich did not dissect to see blood or gore, he dissected to understand. He would trace the intricate pathways of nerves, marvel at the pulley system of tendons that moved a limb, map the chambers of a heart with the reverence of a cartographer discovering a new world. The spark of life, the thing that made the creature more than the sum of its parts, held no interest for him. It was the parts themselves that fascinated him, their design, their function, their failure points. He would capture insects, pinning them to a board of cork not to kill them instantly but to immobilize them. He would then proceed with his tiny instruments, carefully removing a leg, then a wing, observing not the creature's death throes, but the specific change in its ability to function. How long could a beetle live without its antennae? How did a moth's flight pattern alter with one wing clipped? He logged these observations in a small, neat notebook, his script already precise and devoid of flourish. The pinnacle of his childhood research was a mouse, caught in a trap in the pantry, was only stunned. Heinrich brought it to his workbench, his heart not pounding with cruelty, but beating with the steady, focused rhythm of a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. He sedated it with a drop of ether, then secured it with tiny leather straps he had fashioned himself. For hours he worked, his movements slow and exact. He exposed the delicate network of nerves along its spine, applying minute pressures with a fine probe and noting the corresponding twitches in its limbs. He was not torturing the animal. He was conducting an electrical survey of its nervous system. The mouse's small black eyes were wide with a terror he did not see, its rapid breaths a variable he noted only as an indicator of stress levels. When the small heart finally fluttered and stopped, Heinrich felt a wave of not remorse, but profound frustration. The subject had expired before he could complete his mapping. He sat back, looking at the small, still form on the tray, its secrets half revealed. The failure was not in the creature's death, but in his own lack of complete control over its biological processes. He had not been able to keep it alive long enough to finish. That night he wrote in his journal, his conclusion simple and chilling. Asterisk, to truly understand a mechanism, one must possess absolute authority over its operation. The subject must not be allowed the autonomy to fail. Control must be total. Asterisk. That boy in the quiet, sunlit room smelling of chemicals and death was already the man who would one day command the Berlin dungeon. The cold fascination with dissection had simply found a larger, more complex canvas. The desire for control over living things had not been born in the damp dark under the city. It had been nurtured there in the silence of his youth, a seed planted in sterile soil that would one day grow into a forest of unimaginable suffering. The brazier glowed with a heart of concentrated heat, its coals a bed of pulsating orange and red that seemed to breathe in the dimness of the chamber. Nestled within them, 3 irons rested, their tips gradually shifting from dull black to a faint, shimmering cherry, and finally to a searing, brilliant white. The air above them wavered with the intensity, carrying the scent of scorched metal and impending agony. Heinrich von Stahl stood before it, his features cast in sharp relief by the hellish light, his expression one of serene, focused preparation. This was not an act of rage. It was a procedure, and the irons were his sterilized, precise instruments. He selected the first iron, its handle wrapped in insulated leather to protect his own skin. He did not brandish it like a weapon. He held it with the steady confidence of a surgeon lifting a scalpel. The subject, a man accused of sabotage, was secured to an upright wooden frame, his back exposed, muscles taut with anticipation. His breathing was ragged, his eyes screwed shut against what he knew was coming. Heinrich approached, his footsteps silent on the stone. The first touch was not a savage press, but a deliberate, controlled application. The white-hot metal met the flesh just below the left shoulder blade. There was a sizzle, brief and sharp, like fat in a pan, and the unmistakable, nauseating odor of burning hair and skin bloomed in the air. The man jerked against his restraints, a guttural cry tearing from his throat. Heinrich held the iron for exactly 3 seconds, duration he had calculated to cauterize nerve endings almost instantly, minimizing prolonged burning sensation while maximizing the initial, shocking burst of agony. He withdrew it, and in its place was a perfect, blistering circle, the edges already rising in an angry, raised welt. He did not pause. He moved to the second location, on the opposite side of the spine, and repeated the process with the same unhurried precision. Another cry, weaker this time, choked with despair. Each application was strategically placed avoiding major organs, large blood vessels, and the spine itself. This was not about maiming or killing. It was about mapping the nervous system with pain. He targeted clusters of nerves near the surface, areas rich with sensory receptors that would translate the heat into pure, undiluted signals of torment. The third iron found its place on the lower back. The man's screams had subsided into broken whimpers, his body shaking uncontrollably, slick with a cold sweat that seemed to steam in the heated air. Heinrich observed the reactions with a clinical eye, noting the dilation of the pupils, the spike in heart rate, the specific muscular contractions that followed each application. He was not inflicting wounds. He was conducting a symphony of suffering, each note a precise, calculated point of contact between metal and nerve. When he returned the iron to the brazier, its tip already cooling to a dull gray, the man hung limp in his bonds, sobbing quietly. 3 perfect, angry marks stood out on his back, already blistering and weeping. The pain would be profound, a deep, throbbing fire that would persist for days, a constant reminder of the doctor's control. But there would be no fatal infection, no permanent paralysis, no loss of limb function. The subject was damaged, but crucially, he remained viable. He would heal enough to be used again. His new scars serving as a testament to Heinrich's artistry, a masterpiece of agony designed not to destroy, but to endure and to terrify all who heard its story whispered through the stones. The great clock in the guardroom told midnight, its deep, sonorous chime absorbed by the endless stone, a ghost of a sound in a place that had long forgotten the rhythms of the world above. With the changing of the guard came a subtle shift in the dungeon's atmosphere. The day's brutal, clinical efficiency gave way to something older, more primal. The artificial pools of lamplight seemed to shrink, their edges fraying into oppressive shadows that clung to the corners like malevolent spirits. The air, always cold, grew colder still, carrying on its stagnant breath the symphony of the damned. This was the hour when the suffering found its voice. Freed from the immediate presence of their tormentor, the prisoner's restraint crumbled. Moans that had been stifled by daylight now escaped cracked lips, echoing down the corridors in a low, continuous drone of misery. A ragged cough from one cell was answered by a whimper from another, a call and response of shared agony. From the deepest oubliettes came the faint, mad scratching of nails on stone, the only proof that something still lived in the absolute dark. And always, underpinning it all, the relentless drip of water, a metronome counting out the seconds of an endless sentence. Heinrich von Stahl paced. His private study, usually a sanctuary of order, felt suddenly confining, its silence a mockery of the cacophony beyond his door. The precise notations in his journal, which had brought him such satisfaction hours before, now seemed inadequate. Mere scratches on paper that failed to capture the raw data of the night. A restlessness plagued him, a gnawing dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with an experiment left unresolved. He left his quarters and began to walk the corridors, a pale specter in the semi-darkness. The few night guards on duty stiffened as he passed, their eyes fixed ahead, hoping his restless energy would not focus on them. He moved through the chambers, his gaze sweeping over the empty racks, the cold braziers, the silent Iron Maiden standing like a slumbering sentinel. Everything was in its place, everything was ordered, and yet it felt incomplete. The instruments were dormant, the variables of pain paused, and this cessation felt like a personal failure. He paused before a cell door, listening to the ragged, sleep-starved breathing of the occupant within. It was Eliza Vogt. Her defiance, though fractured, had not yet been extinguished. It was a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of control he was weaving, an anomaly that refused to be reconciled. The sounds of the dungeon, the moans, the whimpers, the dripping water, were not just noise to him. They were feedback, a chorus of results. But her stubborn silence, even in her broken state, was a void, an unanswered question, that left him profoundly unsatisfied. He resumed his pacing, his footsteps the only measured sound in the chaos. The night was not a time of rest. It was an intermission, a pause in the grand performance that he alone was conducting. And for a conductor of suffering, silence was the only true failure. The echoes of pain were a testament to his work, but they were also a reminder of its limitations. He had not yet achieved the ultimate control, the power to command not just the body's agony, but the soul's absolute surrender. Until that was his, the night shift would always find him pacing, restless and unsatisfied. A king in a kingdom of screams that was still, somehow, not enough. The woman stood in the antechamber, like a ghost from another world, her presence a jarring anomaly amidst the dungeon's grim functionality. She was small, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that did little to conceal the tremors racking her thin frame. Her face was a landscape of exhaustion and fear, etched with lines that spoke of sleepless nights and a grief that had taken root deep within her soul. Her hands, clutched tightly before her, were work-roughened and clean, a stark contrast to the grime that coated every surface around her. She was the mother of Lucas, the young bookbinder's apprentice, whose passionate, foolish words about freedom had earned him a cell in the deepest, coldest wing. She had been waiting for hours, ignored by the guards who passed with averted eyes. Her silent vigil, a small, desperate island of maternal love in an ocean of institutionalized cruelty. When the door to Heinrich's study finally opened and he emerged, her breath caught in her throat. She did not rush forward. She seemed to fold in on herself even further, as if trying to make her plea as small and unassuming as possible, to avoid provoking his ire. She took a single, hesitant step, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that seemed to tear itself from the very depths of her being. She spoke of her son not as a political entity, not as a subject in a file, but as a boy. She spoke of his gentle hands, skilled with leather and gold leaf, not with weapons or pamphlets. She spoke of a childhood fever that had nearly taken him, of his love for stray cats, of his laugh that used to fill their small kitchen. Her words were a tapestry of mundane, precious memories, each one a plea for mercy woven with the threads of a mother's love. She did not argue his innocence or the justice of the state. She simply begged, her voice breaking on a sob, for his life. She offered everything she had, her own life, in exchange for his, her meager savings, her eternal gratitude, anything at all, if only he would be spared. Heinrich von Stahl listened with the detached patience of a man observing a curious insect. He did not interrupt her, allowed the full weight of her desperation to hang in the air between them. A tangible force of raw, human emotion that seemed to have no effect on him whatsoever. When her words finally faltered and died, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing and the ever-present drip of water, he regarded her for a long, silent moment. His ice-blue eyes held no pity, no impatience, no anger. They were simply empty. He finally spoke, his voice a flat, calm monotone that was more devastating than any shout could have been. He informed her that her son was a prisoner of the state, held under specific orders from authorities whose wisdom and necessity were beyond question. His case was a matter of national security, not familial sentiment. The procedures that applied to him were not subject to personal appeal or emotional interference. They were dictated by the needs of the Reich, and his role was to carry them out with the precision and dispassion required. There would be no special considerations. There would be no mercy. The orders were explicit. He did not say the words with malice. He stated them, as one might recite a mathematical formula or a passage from a technical manual. Her love, her grief, her offer of sacrifice, they were irrelevant variables, noise to be filtered out of the clean equation of his duty. He watched as the last flicker of hope in her eyes guttered and died, extinguished by the absolute, chilling finality of his words. Her shoulders slumped, the last of her strength leaving her. She did not cry out. She simply turned, a broken automaton, and allowed a guard to lead her back the way she had come, back to the world of sunlight and suffering from which she had briefly descended. Heinrich watched her go for a moment, then turned and re-entered his study, closing the door on the echo of her plea, as if it had never been uttered at all. The incident was already forgotten, an insignificant interruption in the orderly progression of his work. The tailor's hands were his life, and Heinrich von Stahl held them in his own with the reverence of a connoisseur examining a fine instrument. They were not the soft, uncalloused hands of a clerk or intellectual. These were the strong, clever hands of a craftsman, fingers stained with dye and marked with the faint silver scars of 1,000 needles. They could measure a bolt of cloth by feel alone, could guide a stitch through the toughest wool with unerring accuracy. Now, they were bound at the wrists, palms upward on the cold iron plate of the thumbscrew device, utterly vulnerable. The man, a wiry fellow named Becker, had been accused of stitching coded messages into the linings of officers' coats, a crime of such elegant audacity that it had earned him Heinrich's particular attention. Heinrich had personally overseen the restoration of the thumbscrews. The old rusted screws had been replaced with finely threaded steel, each turn calibrated to apply a measured, increasing pressure. A small dial, engraved with minute graduations, was fitted to the side, its needle poised to record the exact force being exerted. This was not to be a crude crushing. It was to be a meticulous dissection of resistance, bone by tiny bone. Heinrich positioned Becker's thumbs between the plates, the cold metal a stark contrast to the living warmth of his skin. The man's breathing was shallow, rapid, his eyes fixed on the device, as if he could already feel the ghost of the agony to come. The first turn of the screw was barely perceptible. The plates closed the slightest fraction, a firm, unyielding pressure that was more a promise than a pain. Becker flinched, a tremor running through his arms. Heinrich noted the reaction, his gaze clinical. He waited, allowing the man's imagination to amplify the sensation, to feel the potential for destruction held within the simple mechanism. The silence in the chamber was broken only by the drip of water and the tailor's increasingly ragged breaths. Another quarter turn. Pressure increased, becoming a distinct, deep ache that began to radiate up through the bones of the hands. Becker's jaw clenched, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes were wide, fixed on his own thumbs, watching as the flesh began to pale and distend under the relentless, gradual compression. Heinrich watched too, but he saw not hands, but a complex structure of metacarpals and phalanges. A network of nerves and tendons now being subjected to a precisely quantified stress. He noted the point at which the man's knuckles began to whiten, the subtle shift in the alignment of the joints. A third turn. The ache sharpened into a bright, focused point of agony, centered in the base of each thumb. Becker cried out, a short, sharp sound that was swallowed by the stone walls. Tears welled in his eyes, not just from the pain, but from the horrifying understanding of what was being taken from him. These hands were his identity, his livelihood, his art. The screws were not just crushing bone, they were erasing him. Heinrich observed the tears with interest, a data point on the correlation between targeted physical trauma and psychological devastation. He made a note in his journal, his script unwavering. He continued the process with methodical slowness, a quarter turn at a time, pausing between each increment to observe and record. The crack, when it came, was not a loud snap, but a muffled, wet pop, a sound felt more than heard. Becker screamed, a raw, uninterrupted sound of pure anguish, as the delicate bones in his right thumb gave way. The left followed moments later. The plates were now stained, the skin purpling and swelling grotesquely around the metal. The hands that had created beauty were now a ruined, pulpy mess. Heinrich finally stopped, not out of mercy, but because the useful data had been extracted. The structural failure was complete. He made a final notation, the exact dial reading, at the moment of fracture then, gestured for the guards to release the mechanism. Becker slumped forward, cradling his destroyed hands against his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Heinrich looked down at the broken craftsman, his expression one of calm satisfaction. The message had been delivered not just to Becker, but to anyone who might think to use their skills against the Reich. And the experiment had been a success. He had mapped the precise mechanics of breaking a man, not through his spirit, but through the very thing that made him who he was. The arrival was heralded not by any clamor, but by a subtle shift in the dungeon's oppressive rhythm. The usual sounds of misery seemed to dampen, the guards' footsteps adopting a new, tense precision. Their eyes darting toward the main entrance with a mixture of fear and expectation. Superior was coming. A man from the clean, sunlit world of ministries and power, descending into this abscess of the Reich to inspect its workings. Heinrich von Stahl received the notification without a flicker of emotion, his mind already shifting from the application of pain to the presentation of results. The dungeon was not a place of horror to him. It was a facility, and he was its director, preparing for a performance review. Obersturmbannführer Vogel arrived precisely on time, his polished boots clicking decisively on the stone floor, a sound that seemed alien amidst the usual scrape and shuffle. He was a man in his 50s, with a rigid carriage and a face that had long ago perfected the art of looking through unpleasantness rather than at it. His uniform was immaculate, the black wool seeming to repel the very dust of the place. Did not flinch at the scent of fear and old rust. He merely took a shallow, controlled breath, as if passing a middling sewer. Heinrich led the tour with the dispassionate air of a museum curator. I know you. He did not showcase screaming victims or bloodied instruments. Instead, he presented his modifications, the calibrated rack with its measuring dial, the restored Iron Maiden, the organized logbooks filled with neat, precise script. He spoke in the same flat, pedagogical tone he used with the guards, using terms like enhanced interrogation, yield, subject viability management, and psychological attrition rates. He pointed to the clean, organized shelves where instruments were now sterilized and stored, a testament to his war against the dungeon's former sloppiness. Vogel listened, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze sweeping over the clinical nightmare without visible reaction. He paused before the new waterboarding apparatus, his eyes tracing the enameled pitcher and the angled board. Heinrich explained its refinements, emphasizing the controlled simulation of drowning and the valuable data on respiratory distress and revival techniques. Vogel nodded slowly, a faint, approving glint in his cold eyes. He did not ask about the subjects, their crimes, or their suffering. He asked about throughput. He asked about confession rates. He asked about repeatability of results. They concluded the tour in Heinrich's study, a haven of order amidst the chaos. Vogel accepted a glass of brandy, his fingers not trembling on the crystal. He glanced at the open journal on the desk, its pages filled with anatomical sketches and stress calculations, and a thin, cold smile touched his lips. He raised his glass in a small, sardonic toast. "Your efficiency is commendable, Herr Doctor," Vogel said, his voice a dry rustle. "The old commandant was a brute, a wasteful brute. You have brought a necessary precision to the operation. The Reich appreciates such diligence." The praise hung in the air, a monstrous understatement. He was commending Heinrich for turning a slaughterhouse into a laboratory, for replacing wanton cruelty with calculated scientific agony. He was praising the efficiency of horror. Vogel drained his glass and set it down, his eyes finally meeting Heinrich's. There was no need for further words. The message was clear. The work was unpleasant but necessary. And as long as it was conducted with this level of cold, dispassionate control, it would be sanctioned, supported, and ignored. The Obersturmbannführer turned and left, his polished boots carrying him back to the world of light and power, leaving Heinrich alone once more with his terrible, efficient silence. The visit was over. The work was approved. The horror could continue, refined and unchallenged. Klaus's resolve, already fractured by the doctor's cold threat against his family, finally shattered into 1,000 desperate pieces. It was the boy, the bookbinder's apprentice, whose mother had come to plead. Lucas lay shivering in his cell, his feverish whispers a constant, pathetic litany for water. The guards on duty scoffed, turning a deaf ear to the weak cries, but to Klaus, each murmur was an accusation, a nail hammered into the coffin of his own humanity. The memory of the mother's broken face superimposed itself over the boy's fever-flushed one, and a reckless, suicidal compassion overrode the terror that had governed him for weeks. Waiting for the moment the corridor was clear, Klaus fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so violently the metal ring chimed softly against the iron bars. He slipped into the cell, a stolen crust of bread and a small cup of water clutched in his hand. The boy's eyes, glazed with fever, fluttered open, a spark of pathetic gratitude in their depths. It was that spark, that tiny echo of a world where kindness still existed, that undid Klaus completely. He helped the boy sip the water, his own tears mixing with the spilled drops on the stone floor. He did not hear the door to the chamber swing open, did not sense the presence that filled the doorway like a sudden drop in temperature. Heinrich von Stahl stood there, a silhouette against the lamplit corridor. His arrival, as silent and inevitable as a shadow. He did not shout. He did not need to. His mere presence was a condemnation.
House!
Froze, the cup slipping from his fingers to clatter on the stones, the sound absurdly loud in the sudden suffocating silence. The boy whimpered, curling into a ball. Heinrich's gaze swept over the scene, the guard, the prisoner, the bread, the spilled water, and his expression did not change. It remained one of cold, analytical interest, as if he were observing a particularly predictable flaw in an experimental procedure. He did not order Klaus's immediate arrest. That would have been wasteful. Instead, he issued a command, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. The prisoner was to be moved to the interrogation chamber, and Klaus was to assist. The order was not a punishment. It was a lesson, the next phase in the guard's re-education. Klaus was made to strap the trembling, feverish boy to the angled board himself. His fingers fumbling with the leather restraints, each click of a buckle sounding like the report of a pistol in the silent room. Heinrich prepared the pitcher and the cloth with his usual meticulous care, explaining the procedure to Klaus as if he were a new apprentice, his tone chillingly pedagogical. He described the physiological stages of waterboarding, the precise point at which the mammalian diving reflex would override conscious control, the optimal duration of each cycle to maximize psychological impact without triggering premature shutdown. He spoke of the boy's fever as an interesting variable, one that might lower his resistance threshold and provide valuable comparative data. Klaus stood rigid, his face a mask of horror, forced to listen to the clinical dissection of the torment he was about to witness, and in which he was now complicit. When Heinrich began to pour the water, Klaus was forced to hold the boy's head steady, to feel the convulsive jerks of his body, to see the terror in his eyes from inches away. He was not just watching the torture, it was an integral part of its machinery, his own hands facilitating the agony he had tried to alleviate. The doctor's lesson was perfect, absolute, and utterly damning. Klaus's attempt at mercy had not saved the boy. It had only ensnared them both deeper in the doctor's terrible experiment, breaking the guard not through threat, but through forced participation, grafting his soul irrevocably to the machinery of pain. Heinrich's obsession with absolute control found its purest expression in the oubliette. It was not an instrument of pain, but an instrument of erasure, vertical tomb carved from the dungeon's deepest, coldest stone, a shaft that plunged into a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow sound, light, and time itself. The name, from the French oublier, to forget, was a perfect, chilling summary of its purpose. For days, he had overseen its excavation and refinement, clearing decades of debris and bones from the pit, ensuring its walls were smooth and unforgiving, its depth precisely measured to eliminate any hope of escape or rescue. The only feature was a heavy iron grate set into the ceiling through which a meager ration of stale bread and a cup of water would be dropped once daily, a cruel mockery of sustenance, designed to prolong the experience, not to nourish. The first to be consigned to the void was a defiant printer, whose spirit had proven irritatingly resilient to more direct methods. The guards dragged him to the edge, his struggles feeble against their practiced grip. Heinrich observed his journal in hand as they lifted the grate. The opening revealed nothing but a blackness so complete it seemed a solid thing, a void that exhaled a breath of ancient, damp cold. A man's eyes, wide with a terror beyond the fear of pain, stared into that abyss. And his final, choked cry was not one of protest, but of utter, soul-deep dread, as he was pushed into the nothingness. The sound of his body hitting the bottom was a distant, wet thud, followed by a silence more terrible than any scream. Heinrich made a note of the time. The experiment had begun. For the next several days, the routine was unvaried. The grate would be lifted at the same hour, the meager ration dropped into the blackness. Sometimes, a faint animal-like whimper would float up from the depths. Most times, there was only silence. Heinrich would stand at the edge, listening, his head tilted, recording the gradual diminishment of sound, the slow erosion of a human presence. He was not interested in the physical suffering, the cold, the hunger, the bruises. Those were base variables. He was charting the psychological unraveling, the death of hope, the dissolution of self in the absence of all stimulus, all reference, all light. After 4 days, a rope ladder was lowered. What they hauled back to the surface was no longer the defiant printer. It was a creature reduced to its most primitive state, shivering, covered in filth, its eyes vacant and unseeing, its mind scoured clean by the absolute solitude and sensory deprivation. It made no sound, offered no resistance. It had been forgotten, and in being forgotten, it had forgotten itself. Heinrich examined the wretch with clinical interest, noting the physiological signs of exposure and starvation, but his true fascination was with the hollowed-out psyche. The oubliette had not broken the man's body, had deleted his spirit. It was the ultimate expression of control, the power to unmake a person not through violence, but through the simple, terrible application of nothingness. He gave a satisfied nod and made his final entry. The experiment was a resounding success. Had discovered the most efficient tool in his arsenal. He had broken her body, starved her mind, and stretched her nerves to their screaming limit, yet a stubborn, irreducible core of her remained. Elisa Vogt, strapped to the cold interrogation chair, was a portrait of utter ruin, her skin pale and clammy, her eyes sunken into bruised hollows, her frame trembling with a constant, uncontrollable tremor. But when Heinrich von Stahl leaned in close to examine the dilation of her pupils, to savor the final total victory his meticulous science had wrought, she found one last reservoir of strength. It was not a physical reserve, but a moral one, drawn from a well of defiance so deep his torments could not drain it. With a convulsive jerk of her head, she gathered the scant moisture left in her parched mouth and spat. It was not a grand gesture. It was a weak, pathetic thing, a mere fleck of spittle that landed on the immaculate wool of his uniform jacket, just above the cold polished metal of the Reich. But in the absolute silence of the chamber, the small wet sound was as explosive as a gunshot. It was not an act of physical resistance, it was a symbolic annihilation of his authority, a final, desperate refusal to acknowledge his power over her soul. Her eyes, though clouded with exhaustion and pain, met his with a last blazing flash of pure, undiluted contempt. For a heartbeat, the dungeon's perpetual chill seemed to deepen. The guards flanking the door froze, their breath catching in their throats. They waited for the explosion of rage, for the brutal, immediate retaliation that such an insult demanded. But Heinrich did not move. He did not flinch or recoil. He slowly straightened up, his expression not one of anger, but of intense, almost fascinated curiosity. His gloved fingers rose and carefully, fastidiously wiped the small spot of moisture from his jacket. He examined his glove tip, then looked back at her, his head tilted as if she were a particularly intriguing equation that had just produced an unexpected result. The anger that should have been there was absent, replaced by something far more terrifying, a profound and chilling intellectual engagement. Her defiance, even in this broken state, was a variable his calculations had not accounted for, was an anomaly, a flaw in the perfect logic of his control. And for Heinrich von Stahl, an anomaly was not an offense to be punished. It was a problem to be solved, a challenge to his expertise that demanded a new, more refined approach. He turned away from her without another glance, his mind already racing, discarding his previous methods as inadequate. Standard torments were useless. They'd already been applied and had failed to reach this final, stubborn kernel of self. Something new was required, something psychological, exquisitely personal, designed not to inflict pain upon her body, but to dismantle the very foundations of her identity, to turn the source of her strength into the instrument of her absolute ruin. He would design a torment not for a prisoner, but for Elisa Vogt alone. A smile, thin and cold, touched his lips as he walked toward his study, the door closing behind him on the woman who had for one fleeting moment defeated him. The spit on his jacket was not a stain of her shame, but the first mark of his newest and most personal project. The ultimate instrument of control was not a device of metal and wood, but an absence of void sculpted with meticulous intent. Heinrich von Stahl had chosen his next subject with care, a young philosophy student, his mind sharp, his spirit buoyed by abstract ideals, and the unshakable belief in the power of reason. This was the perfect canvas for Heinrich, his most refined experiment yet, a exploration of the mind's dissolution in the total absence of external stimulus. The student's cell was not merely a prison, it was to be a sensory vacuum, a psychological cage from which there was no escape. The transformation was swift and absolute. Every source of light was extinguished. The cracks around the heavy door sealed with tar-soaked rags until not a sliver of illumination could penetrate the blackness. The air grew still and dead, the distant. Echoing sounds of the dungeon muffled into nothingness by layers of felt and straw packed into the corridor outside. The only thing that remained was the relentless, maddening drip of water from a pipe Heinrich had specifically adjusted a single, monotonous note falling at precise, irregular intervals, designed to fracture any attempt at mental rhythm or prayer. The student was left with a pitcher of water, a loaf of bread, and the absolute, suffocating totality of nothing. Heinrich observed from a specially constructed listening post, a narrow tube that channeled the faintest sounds from the cell to his ear, his journal open before him. The first few hours were marked by a stubborn rationality. He could hear the student pacing the measured length of his cell, his footsteps a steady, deliberate counter-rhythm to the drip. He heard him reciting poetry, then philosophical arguments, his voice a low, confident murmur in the dark, a brave but futile attempt to assert the primacy of thought over the void. Heinrich recorded the duration of this phase, the calm, measured tone of the voice, the subject's baseline resistance. Then, the silence began to work. The pacing grew slower, more erratic. Recitations became repetitions, then fragments, then ceased altogether. The drip of water was no longer a background noise. It became the only event in a universe of non-events, each drop a hammer blow against the thinning walls of sanity. Heinrich heard the first sign of deterioration, a soft, involuntary whimper that escaped the student's lips, followed by a sharp, angry curse directed at nothing. The mind, deprived of all external input, was beginning to feed upon itself. Hours bled into a timeless void. The student's breathing lost its rhythm, becoming shallow and panicked. He began to talk to himself, not in reasoned discourse, but in disjointed, frantic questions. Is this it? His voice rasped from the darkness, a thin, frayed wire of sound. Hello, is anyone there? The questions were met with the same implacable drip, the same unyielding blackness. Heinrich made note of the rising pitch, the tremor of uncertainty that had replaced the steady confidence. The foundations of a rational mind were cracking, and he was there in the silence to record every splintering sound. The drip of water became a metronome, counting out the seconds of the student's unraveling. In the absolute dark, where time had lost all meaning, each drop was a tiny explosion of sensation, the only anchor in a sea of nothingness. At first he had counted them, a desperate attempt to impose order on the void. But the irregular intervals defeated him, twisting his concentration into knots. Now the sound was no longer external. It seemed to originate inside his own skull, a phantom pulse hammering against the thinning walls of his reason. Heinrich, listening at his post, heard the change in the student's breathing. It had shifted from panicked rasps to a low, continuous moan, the sound of a mind scraping against its own confines. Then the whispers began, not from the walls, but from within.
At first,
they were faint, sibilant things, like the rustle of dry leaves in a forgotten corner of his memory. He tried to ignore them, to clench his eyes shut against a darkness that was no different whether they were open or closed. But the whispers grew more insistent, layering over each other until they became distinct, recognizable voices. He heard his late professor calmly dissecting Kant's categorical imperative, the words clear and logical, but then warping into a cold, mocking laugh. He heard his mother singing a lullaby, her gentle melody curdling into a scream of terror. The voices were not memories. They were vivid auditory hallucinations, each one a shard of his past turned against him. He began to answer them. His own voice, hoarse and unfamiliar, rasped replies into the blackness. He argued with the phantom professor about the nature of reality, his sentences becoming increasingly disjointed, his logic fracturing under the strain. He begged his mother to stop screaming, his pleas devolving into ragged sobs. Heinrich listened, his pen moving swiftly across the page, documenting the precise timeline of the breakdown. He noted the transition from internal monologue to externalized response, the content of the hallucinations, the increasing emotional lability. The student was no longer a man in a cell. He was a laboratory of a disintegrating psyche, and every whimper, every shouted non sequitur, was precious data. His body began to rebel in sympathy with his mind. He crawled on the filthy floor, his fingers tracing the same cold stones over and over, as if searching for a seam in reality, a crack through which he could escape. He would suddenly freeze, convinced he was not alone, that something was breathing in the darkness, just inches from his face. He would scramble backward, his back hitting the damp wall, and curl into a fetal position, rocking slowly, his whimpers the only sound besides the eternal, tormenting drip. He forgot the bread, the water. His world had shrunk to the prison of his own skull, a haunted house whose every room was filled with the ghosts of his own making. Heinrich observed it all with a fascination that bordered on reverence. This was purity. This was control, stripped of all unnecessary hardware, reduced to its most elegant and devastating form. He was not causing pain. He was simply removing everything that was not pain, until agony was all that remained. The student's defiance, his reason, his very identity, were being erased not by force, but by absence. In the profound silence of his observation post, Heinrich von Stahl smiled, a cold, satisfied expression unseen in the dark. The psychological cage was not just containing its subject. It was consuming him, and the doctor was there to record every delicious bite. The ultimate expression of Heinrich's philosophy was not a device that inflicted active torment, but one that enforced perfect passive suffering. It was the chain-thick cold links of forged iron that served not as a mere restraint, but as a sculptor of agony. He had them specially forged, each set calibrated to a specific weight and length, designed not to bind, but to contort. The goal was to reduce the human form to a living, breathing statue of pain, a testament to the power of immobility and relentless gravitational anguish. He selected 2 prisoners for the inaugural application. Men whose crimes were insignificant, but whose physical resilience had been noted in his logs. The chamber chosen for the demonstration was one of the oldest, its walls weeping a constant. Slow dampness that kept the air frigid and promoted the stiffening of muscles. Heavy iron rings, newly set into the stone, at precise cruel angles, waited like hungry mouths. The guards brought the men in, their confusion quickly turning to dawning horror as Heinrich explained. In his flat pedagogical tone, the principles of musculoskeletal stress and the particular agony of sustained, unnatural positioning. The first man was forced to his knees. His wrists were shackled behind his back, and then a chain was run from the manacles to a ring set high on the wall behind him. The guards pulled it taut, forcing his arms upward and back in a brutal parody of a bow, stretching his shoulders to their mechanical limits. The strain was immediate and profounded deep, burning ache that settled into the joints with the weight of the iron itself. He could not slump forward. A second chain connected his ankle shackles to a ring in the floor, holding his legs rigid. He was trapped in a kneeling arc, every muscle screaming in protest. His world narrowed to the fire in his shoulders and the cold of the stone beneath his knees. The second man was subjected to a different geometry of misery. He was made to stand on the tips of his toes on a narrow block of wood. His arms were stretched wide, chained to rings on opposite walls, crucifying him in the damp air. The position was one of exquisite balance and unbearable tension. The slightest relaxation of his calf muscles would send his full weight onto his wrists, threatening to dislocate the joints. Holding the position meant an eternity of trembling, agonizing strain in his legs and feet. He was caught in a terrible equilibrium where every second was a choice between 2 different kinds of torment. Then Heinrich and the guards left. The heavy door closed, sealing the men in with the dripping water and the slow, creaking strain of the chains. There was no torture to endure, no onslaught to survive. There was only the position and the relentless accumulating weight of time. Minutes stretched into hours. The initial sharp pain dulled into a deep, throbbing agony that seemed to seep into the very marrow of their bones. Muscles, forced to remain clenched, began to knot and spasm. The cold of the chamber leached into their immobilized limbs, adding a layer of stiffening ache to the burning strain. Heinrich returned at intervals, not to torment them further, but to observe and record. He noted the precise hour when the first man's trembling became uncontrollable, when the kneeling man's back began to seize. He documented the point at which coherent thoughts seemed to leave their eyes, replaced by a glassy, fixed stare of pure endurance. Their world had shrunk to the few inches of space their bodies occupied. their entire universe defined by the unyielding pressure of the iron links. They did not scream. They had no breath for it. They could only moan low, continuous sounds that were the auditory equivalent of their slow breaking. This was the pinnacle of Heinrich's art. It required no tools, no violence, no complicated mechanisms. It required only weight, angle, and time. Chains did the work, enforcing a suffering that was both immense and utterly passive. The prisoners were not being tortured. They were being composed into monuments of agony, their very bodies, the medium and the message. And in the silence of that dripping chamber, surrounded by the evidence of his perfect control, Heinrich von Stahl felt a satisfaction so profound it was almost peace. He had mastered not just the infliction of pain, but the architecture of despair. For a single vertiginous moment, the sterile order of Heinrich's mind fractured. It was not a sound or a sight that triggered it, but a sensation the particular. Bone-deep chill of the Dungeness stones seeping through the fine leather of his boots as he stood observing a prisoner in the chains. The cold was ancient, impersonal, and it whispered of things buried and forgotten. And in that whisper, a memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Himself as a small boy, no more than 5, locked in the dark, windowless linen closet of his family's austere home. His father had done it to cure him of a fear of the dark, a method as brutal as it was simple. The darkness in that closet had not been empty. It had been a living, breathing thing that pressed against his eyes and filled his lungs. He had hammered his small fists against the unyielding wood until they were bruised, screams muffled by stacks of starched sheets that smelled of cedar and dust. The terror had been absolute, a primal certainty that the door would never open, that he would be swallowed by the nothingness forever. He remembered the exact texture of the panic, sharp, acidic, and utterly paralyzing. The memory flashed behind his eyes, vivid and humiliating. The ghost of that old childish fear brushed against his spine with icy fingers. For a heartbeat, he was not the master of this domain, but its victim. The cold stone beneath him transforming into the closet floor, the prisoner's ragged breathing becoming his own stifled sobs. A fissure opened in his impeccably controlled facade, and through it poured a shocking, unwelcome wave of empathy. He saw not a subject, but a man. He felt not data, but suffering. The lapse lasted less than a second. With a violence that was entirely internal, Heinrich recoiled from it. His jaw clenched, his breath catching in a sharp, silent inhalation. The memory was an impurity, a flaw in his psychological armor, a sentimental weakness to be excised immediately. He visualized it as a cancer cell and applied the cold steel of his will to it. The boy in the closet was a weakling, an earlier imperfect version of himself that had been rightly disciplined and overcome. That fear had been burned out of him, replaced by the understanding that control was the only antidote to terror. To feel empathy was to become vulnerable. To understand suffering was to risk being infected by it. He focused his gaze on the chained prisoner with renewed intensity, forcing the clinical lens back into place. The man's agony was not a shared experience. It was a physiological process to be observed. The tremors in his muscles were fascinating neuromuscular responses. The low moans were quantifiable indicators of distress thresholds. Heinrich's own brief, treacherous moment of feeling was relegated to the status of an anomalous blip, a piece of faulty wiring in his own magnificent machine that had been identified and corrected. By the time he drew his next breath, the fissure had been sealed, the memory shoved back into the deep vault of his mind where it belonged. The dungeon's chill was just a temperature reading, the suffering was just data, and he was once again perfectly, coldly in control. The idea came to him not in a flash of inspiration, but as a slow, chilling crystallization of purpose, born from the lingering humiliation of Elisa's defiance. He required a method that transcended physical pain, something that would bypass her hardened resistance and strike at the most primal, unreasoning core of her being. He needed a terror that was ancient, visceral, and utterly inescapable, and so he designed the rat cage. It was a deceptively simple contraption, a testament to his belief that the most elegant horrors often required the least complex machinery. A small, cylindrical cage, forged from thin, strong bands of iron, one end open and rimmed with sharp teeth meant to bite into flesh. The other end was a solid plate, behind which rested a small brazier. its coals glowing with a subdued, malevolent heat. The cage was just large enough to hold a single, large sewer-bred rat. Its eyes gleaming with a feral panic, its claws scrabbling frantically against the unyielding metal. He had Elisa brought to the chamber and forced into a supine position on a stone slab, her torso exposed. He did not speak to her, offered no explanation, his silence more threatening than any boast or threat could have been. With clinical detachment, he placed the open end of the cage against the soft skin of her abdomen, the metal teeth pressing coldly into her flesh. The rat inside, sensing the confinement and the growing heat from the opposite end, emitted a high, frantic squeaking. Then Heinrich began to feed the coals. It was not a sudden blast of heat, but a gradual, meticulous increase. The metal bands of the cage began to warm, then to grow uncomfortably hot. The rat, trapped and terrified, reacted as any creature would when faced with a searing threat from behind. It tried to burrow forward, away from the source of its agony. Its claws, designed for digging through filth and decay, now scrabbled against human skin. The sharp, desperate scratching was a violation more intimate than any blade. The true horror was not in the pain, which was sharp and lacerating, but in the inevitable, instinctive solution the animal's panic would devise. As the heat became unbearable, the rat would seek any escape, and the only way forward was through. The concept was ancient, a piece of folk horror Heinrich had refined into a precise science. He watched his expression, one of intense focus. As the creature's frantic efforts to dig its way out of the metal prison became a nightmarish excavation into living flesh, a veteran guard, a man who had witnessed flayings and burnings and the crushing of bones without flinching, turned a sickly shade of gray. The sound, the frantic squealing of the animal, the wet, tearing struggle, the choked gasp from Eliza was something new and unspeakable. Another guard looked away, his hand rising involuntarily to his mouth. This was not the clean, measured application of pain they had become accustomed to. This was something raw, bestial, and grotesquely intimate. It was horror in its most primal form, and it bypassed all their desensitized defenses to coil like a cold snake in the pits of their stomachs. Rick noted their reactions with peripheral interest, another data point on the spectrum of human aversion. But his primary focus remained on Eliza. He watched for the moment her formidable will would be overridden by a deeper, older terror, for the point where the specific intellectual fear of him would be consumed by the absolute animal fear of being devoured alive from the inside. The rat cage was not just a tool of torture. It was the ultimate argument against the resilience of the human spirit, a dark miracle of pain. It's designed to prove that even the strongest defiance could be undone by the simple, frantic panic of a cornered beast. A desperate, fleeting hope was a dangerous contagion in the Berlin dungeon, and it found its most volatile host in a man named Richter, a former locksmith whose clever fingers had not yet been broken. The chance came not through cunning planning, but through a moment of pure, chaotic accident à garde, new and nervous fumbling. The heavy key ring, as he delivered a meager meal, the iron clattering to the floor just outside the cell bars. In the heartbeat it took for the guard to curse and bend to retrieve it, Richter's hand shot through the gap, his long, nimble fingers closing around a single, promising key. It was not the key to freedom, but to the inner guard post, a chance, however slim, to navigate one layer of the labyrinth. The next hours were an eternity of silent, heart-pounding tension. Richter waited for the shift change. For the moment when the corridors were briefly filled with the comings and goings of guards, their attention divided. When the moment came, he moved with a ghost's silence, the stolen key turning with a smooth, welled click in the lock of his own cell. The door swung inward a silent inch, a gap that felt like the opening to another world. He slipped into the hallway, pressing himself into the deep shadows, his breath held, every sense screaming. He navigated by memory and desperation, using the key twice more to bypass inner gates. Each successful turn fueling a wild, terrifying hope. The scent of the upper world, a faint whisper of cold night air from a distant ventilation shaft, seemed to guide him, sirens call away from the suffocating dread. His luck ran out at the final checkpoint before the older, less guarded tunnels that might have offered a true path to escape. A veteran guard, rounding a corner on his routine patrol, froze at the sight of the unlocked gate and the shadowy figure beyond. A shout echoed down the stone passage, a sound that had not been heard in these depths for years, a sound of alarm, of breached security. The response was immediate and brutal. Guards converged from every direction, not with the hurried chaos of surprise, but with a cold, efficient fury. They were not just recapturing a prisoner. They were stamping out an infection, a challenge to the absolute order Dr. von Stahl had imposed. Richter was cornered, beaten down, not with rage, but with a systematic, professional violence that left him broken and bleeding on the cold stone. Before he had even been dragged back to the main chamber, the news of the attempt did not anger Heinrich. It intrigued him. Anomalies were rare. And this was a significant one, a test of his system's security and a perfect opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of hope. He descended to the main chamber where Richter had been thrown, his arrival causing the assembled guards to snap to a tense, fearful attention. The would-be escapee lay moaning on the floor, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, his face a mask of blood and despair. Heinrich circled him slowly, a predator assessing its prey, his expression one of cold, analytical interest. He did not see a man. He saw a breached protocol, a variable that required correction. He did not order a standard punishment. That would have been insufficient, a mere reaction. He designed a response. Richter was to be made an example, but the lesson was not to be about the pain of failure, but about the absolute futility of hope itself. Heinrich personally oversaw the brutal ceremony that followed. The man was stripped and bound to a post in the central chamber within sight and sound of every cell door. Then, with methodical, unhurried precision, Heinrich directed the guards in the application of the lash. But it was not a frenzied beating. It was a measured, calculated dismantling. Each stroke was counted aloud, each landing on a carefully selected part of the body to maximize agony without inducing unconsciousness. The message was not written in blood, but in the relentless, dispassionate rhythm of the punishment rhythm that said, order had been restored, that hope was a phantom, and that the doctor's control was infinite, inescapable, and utterly without mercy. The escape attempt was over. The lesson had just begun. The black leather journal lay open on the polished expanse of Heinrich's desk, a stark island of potential in the sea of his controlled existence. Each night, after the screams had subsided to a low, persistent hum, and the guards had retreated into their own uneasy silences, he would open it. The act was not one of reflection, but of transcription, a sacred ritual, where the day's chaotic data was filtered through his intellect and rendered into perfect, immutable order. The entries were not confessions. They were case studies, each subject reduced to a series of letters. In numbers, their agonies catalogued with the dispassionate precision of a botanist noting the properties of a rare fern. The early entries had been clinical, focused on methodology and physiological response. But as the weeks bled into months, a subtle shift occurred. The pronoun I began to feature more prominently, not as a participant, but as a prime mover. I have observed became I have determined. The subject responded, transformed into, I elicited the response. His role was no longer that of an administrator of pain, but its originator, its architect. The suffering he documented was not an unfortunate byproduct of state policy. It was a testament to his own will, a symphony he alone conducted. The dungeon was not a facility he ran. It was a kingdom he had forged in darkness, and every cry was a hymn to his authority. His observations of his victims underwent a parallel transformation. They were no longer referred to as prisoners or even subjects, but as materials or specimens. Their personalities, their histories, their fears, the messy, human complexities that had once been data points for psychological manipulation were now irrelevant impediments to pure research. He wrote of Elisa Wagg's defiance, not as a moral challenge, but as a fascinating anomaly in resilience, a stubborn variable that required a more refined equation to solve. He described the locksmith's failed escape not as an act of desperate courage, but as a valuable stress test of his security protocols. Their humanity had been systematically erased from the pages, replaced by a cold taxonomy of breaking points and thresholds. A profound, unshakable certainty began to permeate every line. He wrote of his methods not as techniques, but as revelations. Calibrated turn of a screw, the precise angle of a chain. The calculated duration of sensory deprivation, these were not tools of torture, but keys to unlocking the fundamental truths of human existence. He believed he was peering into the very soul of man, not through philosophy or art, but through the application of measured agony. He saw the moment of absolute surrender, not as a tragedy, but as a moment of sublime clarity. The instant when a complex, flawed being was finally reduced to its most honest, base state, a creature that would trade its every principle for a single, gasped breath. The final stage of this metamorphosis was the most chilling. The journal entries began to take on a tone of divine right. "I have granted the specimen a reprieve," he wrote, "of reviving a nearly drowned man. I have allowed the material to retain consciousness," he noted, when adjusting a torture to avoid unconsciousness. His control over life and death, over pain and its cessation, was no longer a duty. It was a prerogative. He was no longer a doctor or a commandant. In the silent, confident script that filled the pages, he had become a god of a very small, very dark universe, perhaps, but one whose power within it was absolute and unquestionable. The entries were no longer records. They were scripture, written in the ink of suffering, chronicling the reign of a deity whose only commandment was the absolute perfection of his own terrible will. The transformation was not a shattering, but a settling, a final, chilling descent into a stillness more absolute than any death. The Klaus who had once trembled at the Iron Maiden, who had stolen bread for a feverish boy, was gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out instrument, his eyes devoid of the light that had once flickered with doubt and fear. The doctor's lesson, delivered through forced participation in the water cure, had been perfectly, terribly effective. It had not merely threatened Klaus's family. It had grafted his own hands to the machinery of agony, making him an accomplice in the very horror he had sought to soften. The guilt of that complicity was at best that had burned away the last of his moral resistance, leaving behind a smooth, cold surface of unquestioning obedience. He moved through the dungeon's corridors with a new mechanical precision. His footsteps, once hesitant, now fell with the same grim rhythm as the veterans. His gaze, which had once darted away from the suffering in the cells, now swept over it with an empty, assessing calm. He no longer heard the screams as expressions of pain. He heard them as data points, as indicators of the doctor's will being efficiently enacted. When ordered to apply the thumbscrews, his hands were steady on the calibrated dial, his turns measured and exact. He noted the prisoner's reactions with a detached air, his mind cataloging the sounds not as cries of anguish, but as confirmations of a successful procedure. The crack of bone was not a horror. It was an expected outcome, a benchmark reached. The ultimate test came with the rat cage. When the order was given to prepare the device for Eliza Vogt, Klaus did not pale or hesitate. He collected the frantic, squealing animal without a flicker of revulsion, his movements efficient and unemotional. He secured the cage against her skin, his fingers deft and impersonal, as if he were assembling a piece of complex machinery rather than orchestrating a primal nightmare. As the brazier heated and the animal began its frantic, terrible excavation, Klaus stood at attention, his face a mask of blank neutrality. He watched the procedure not with the veteran's sickened aversion, but with the focused attention of a technician, ensuring a process was followed correctly. The sounds of tearing flesh and animal panic were just variables in the equation of breaking, and his role was to ensure the equation balanced. Heinrich observed this new Klaus with silent approval. The young guard. His complete moral annihilation was his most satisfying creation yet, a testament to the power of his methods not just to break resistance, but to reshape it into perfect functional compliance. Klaus was no longer a man with a conscience. He was an extension of the doctor's will, a living tool whose only purpose was to facilitate the work. The breaking was complete. The soul had been excised, and in its place was a void that followed orders without question, a perfect, empty vessel for the endless, pouring darkness of the dungeon. The concept of cold as a tool had long fascinated Heinrich, not for its blunt brutality, but for its slow, insidious, and utterly inescapable nature. While fire and blade demanded application, cold was an absence, a patient leeching that required no effort from the torturer beyond initial setup. It was the ultimate passive instrument, and he devoted a week to its perfection. Small stone cell in the deepest, most naturally frigid part of the dungeon was selected. Its walls already wept a constant icy dampness. Heinrich had the single iron door replaced with a thicker, airtight version, it seems packed with tar. A narrow grate at the top of the door, fitted with a sliding panel, was the only concession to observation and air exchange. A drain was set into the center of the floor. The chamber was then left empty for a day, its temperature dropping until the moisture on the walls began to crystallize into a thin, brittle lace of frost. His first subject was a burly dock worker, a man whose physical strength had proven resistant to more direct methods. Stripped naked, the man was pushed into the cell. The shock of the cold was immediate, a physical blow that drove the air from his lungs in a white plume. The door sealed behind him with a sound of finality. The first hour his body fought back. Heinrich observed through the grate, a stopwatch in his gloved hand, his journal open on a small lectern. He noted the vigorous shivering, the frantic pacing, the rubbing of arms and chests, the body's desperate autonomic attempts to generate heat. The dockworker's skin, initially flushed, quickly paled, taking on a bluish tinge. His shouts of protest became slurred, his movements growing clumsy as the cold seeped into his muscles and nerves. Heinrich recorded it all. The time of entry, the onset of violent shivering, the point at which coherent speech devolved into guttural moans. He was not interested in the man's pain. He was mapping the timeline of hypothermia. After 2 hours, the shivering ceased. This was a critical data point, the body's surrender, the point where it could no longer expend the energy to warm itself. The dockworker slumped into a corner, his movements slow and lethargic, a dangerous drowsiness overtaking him. His mind, addled by the cold, began to betray him. Heinrich noted the confusion in his eyes, the disjointed mumblings, the paradoxical sensation of heat that often precedes the final stages, causing victims to sometimes strip off their clothing. He made no move to intervene. He was waiting for the terminus, the absolute edge of viability, watched as the man's pulse felt at his neck through the grate became thready and weak. His breathing grew shallow and sporadic. Just as the man's eyes began to glaze over, his consciousness flickering out like a guttered candle, Heinrich gave a sharp nod. The door was hauled open. Guards rushed in, wrapping the near corpse in rough blankets and dragging him out into the marginally warmer corridor. Heinrich followed, his attention on his stopwatch. He had his time. 3 hours and 47 minutes from vigorous health to the brink of systemic shutdown for a man of this size and constitution. The dockworker was revived through the application of forced lukewarm broth and vigorous rubbing, a process Heinrich supervised with the same clinical detachment. The man would live, though likely with permanent damage to his extremities. The data, however, was pristine. Heinrich returned to his study and filled several pages with calculations and observations. He now knew the rate of core temperature drop in the chamber, the physiological markers of each stage of hypothermia, and the precise window for recovery. The freezing chamber was not a punishment. It was a chronometer of dying, and he had just calibrated it perfectly. He could now time a man's endurance against the cold, with the same precision he used to measure torque on the rack. It was another variable mastered, another facet of human suffering quantified and added to his terrible, growing encyclopedia of pain. The man they brought before him was unlike any other who had been dragged into the lamplit circle of his domain. He did not struggle against the guard's grip, nor did his eyes dart around the chamber in animal panic. Instead, he moved with a weary dignity, his hands bound before him, not in fists, but folded as if in perpetual prayer. The rough dark cassock he wore was frayed at the cuffs and stained with the grime of his capture. But it hung on his thin frame like a mantle of office, a stubborn declaration of identity in a place designed to strip it away. Father Karl Reinhardt stood before Heinrich von Stahl, his face pale and lined with exhaustion, but his gaze held a calm, unsettling depth that seemed to look through the implements of pain and into the void beyond. Heinrich observed this new specimen with a fresh, sharp interest. Here was a subject whose resistance would not be rooted in political ideology or physical courage, but in something far more abstract and, to Heinrich's mind, far more fascinating: faith. It was a variable he had not yet fully isolated and tested, a psychological structure built on the insubstantial foundation of belief. He dismissed the guards, leaving the two men alone in the chamber. The only sounds, the hiss of the gas lamps and the priest's slow, measured breathing. He began not with threats or restraints, but with a conversation, his voice a soft, almost congenial monotone that was more disarming than any shout. He circled the priest slowly, a scholar examining a rare text, not to debate but to deconstruct. He picked apart the concept of divine love with the precision of a surgeon, questioning how a benevolent God could permit the existence of a place like this, how faith could persist in the face of utter, meaningless suffering. He described the rituals of the church as mere psychological scaffolding, clever mechanisms invented to comfort the weak-minded in the face of a cold and different universe. Each word was a subtle probe, designed not to anger, but to introduce a seed of existential doubt, to corrode the foundations of the priest's certainty from within. He mocked the very symbols the man held sacred. He gestured to a cold iron brazier and compared its palpable, searing heat to the intangible warmth of a promised heaven. He held up a cruel-looking hook and spoke of the crown of thorns as a primitive, theatrical prop, a cheap trick to elicit sympathy for a failed rebellion. His scorn was not hot and passionate. It was icy analytical, and all the more devastating for its utter lack of emotion. He was systematically dismantling the architecture of a lifetime's belief, reducing scripture to fairy tales, and devotion to a neurological glitch, all while watching the priest's face for the first crack in that infuriatingly placid composure. He saw it then, a slight tightening around the eyes, a minute tremor in the bound hands. It was not fear of pain, but the terror of a soul feeling its foundations tremble. A cold smile touched Heinrich's lips. The psychological prelude was complete. The seeds of doubt were planted. Now, it was time to see how deep the roots of faith truly went, and how much agony it would take to tear them out. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the shadows where the guards waited. The mockery ceased. The conversation was over. The experiment was about to begin. The first touch of the heated iron was met not with a scream, but with a prayer. As the searing metal met the flesh of Father Reinhardt's shoulder, branding him with the same clinical precision Heinrich had applied to countless others, the priest's eyes squeezed shut. But his lips did not part in a cry of agony. They moved in a fervent, whispered litany. The words were Latin, ancient, and rhythmic, a stream of sacred language that flowed into the chamber as if from another world entirely. Sanct Michael Archangel, defend nos in prolio.
Ast.
The sizzle of his own flesh seemed to become merely an accompaniment to his devotion, a horrific counterpoint to the plea for heavenly defense. Heinrich paused, the iron held aloft, its tip still glowing with a malevolent light. This was an anomaly. The expected data, the sharp cry, the gasp. The immediate capitulation of the spirit to overwhelming physical stimulus was absent. Instead, the subject was generating a secondary output, a verbal and psychological response that was not fear, but focused piety. Heinrich's analytical mind, momentarily intrigued by the deviation, noted the phenomenon. The pain was being processed not as a reason to break, but as a reason to intensify faith, a perverse fuel for devotion. He proceeded, his movements losing none of their precision but gaining a new, sharper edge of focus. The thumbscrews were applied to the priest's fingers, the calibrated pressure slowly crushing the delicate bones. Again, the response defied the established model. Tears streamed down the man's face. His body trembled violently with the shock of the agony. But his voice, though strained and ragged, did not falter. Cor Jesu sacratissimum, miserere nobis. The prayer became a mantra, a shield woven from words against the reality of the torture. He was not speaking to Heinrich or to the guards. He was speaking through them, to a listener only he could perceive. The constant whispered prayers began to work upon the atmosphere of the chamber in a way screams of pain never had. The guards, who had grown inured to the most visceral horrors, shifted uneasily on their feet. The sacred words spoken in this profane temple of suffering created a dissonance that was deeply unsettling. They were accustomed to fear. They understood terror and despair. This calm, relentless invocation of divine mercy was something alien and strangely threatening. It implied a reality beyond the stone walls and iron instruments, a hope that their power could not extinguish, and it unnerved them. A faint, unfamiliar sensation stirred within Heinrich himself, a cold prickle of irritation that was dangerously close to unease. The priest's endurance was not the frustrating, defiant kind like Eliza Wagg's. It was something else entirely. It was a passive, utter reliance on an external source of strength, a surrender not to the torturer, but to a higher authority. Every tool Heinrich used, every increment of pain he applied, was being offered up by the priest as a kind of perverse sacrament. Heinrich was not breaking him. He was facilitating his martyrdom. The absolute control Heinrich wielded over the man. His physical being was being rendered meaningless by the man. His total disregard for it. The prayers were a constant, quiet reminder that there was a part of his subject, the most important part, to the subject that was entirely beyond his reach. For the first time, Heinrich von Stahl, the master of measurable pain, felt the faint, chilling draft of a door he could not close, a variable he could not quantify, and it unsettled him more than any scream ever could. The screams had long since ceased to be individual expressions of agony, and had instead merged into a single, constant atmospheric condition of the dungeon, as inherent to the place as the dampness in the stones or the chill in the air. They were a low, discordant symphony that echoed through the endless corridors, a sound so persistent it had become a kind of silence, the auditory equivalent of the darkness, a blanket of noise that smothered all other sound. New arrivals would flinch at the cacophony, their nerves shredded by the relentless, anonymous suffering. But for those who dwelled there, guards and prisoners alike, the screams had become the backdrop of existence, a white noise of despair that was noticed only in its absence. Heinrich von Stahl had perfected the art of filtering out the din. To him, the screams were not a chorus of human misery, but a validation of his work, a continuous stream of data, confirming the efficacy of his methods. They were the sound of variables being tested, thresholds being mapped, and control being asserted. He could walk through the main chamber, while a man was being broken on the rack, and registered the pitch and duration of the cries, not as a sign of suffering, but as an indicator of the subject's current tolerance level and the necessary adjustments to the dial. This profound dissociation was never more evident than during his meals. A small, stark alcove off the main guardroom had been designated for his use, a space with a simple wooden table and a single chair. Here, precisely at 7 each evening, a tray would be brought from the kitchens above a plain, but adequate meal of stew, black bread, and a glass of wine. The alcove was not soundproofed. In fact, it was situated such that the echoes from the interrogation chambers were particularly clear. He would sit, unfold a linen napkin across his lap, and begin to eat with the same meticulous, unhurried precision he applied to everything. The spoon would lift to his lips, his chewing was slow and deliberate, his sips of wine measured. All the while the screams would weave around him, a high piercing shriek from the direction of the freezing chamber, a guttural, choked series of sobs from the waterboarding area, the frantic animalistic panic from a cell where the rat cage was being applied. The sounds were stark, horrific, and utterly immediate. He did not ignore them. He acknowledged them, but as one might acknowledge the sound of rain against a window pane, a feature of the environment, irrelevant to the task at hand. His concentration was entirely on his meal, on the taste of the food, the texture of the bread. The agonized cries were just noise, an auditory static that held no more meaning for him than the buzzing of a fly. His ability to dine undisturbed amidst the soundtrack of hell was the ultimate testament to his detachment. He was not a man surrounded by suffering. He was a scientist in his laboratory, and the screams were merely the hum of his equipment, a sign that everything was functioning exactly as he had designed it to. The air in the dungeon changed, acquiring a new, sharp-edged tension that had nothing to do with the suffering in the cells. It was the tension of performance, of inspection. The guards' boots shone with a hasty, nervous polish. Their uniforms were straightened with a rigor unseen since Heinrich's first day, and the usual cacophony of misery was forcibly dampened, the worst of the cries stifled behind hastily closed doors. The message had come down from the world above. A delegation was arriving, high-ranking officials from the Ministry of Justice, and the SS come to inspect the efficiency of Berlin's most notorious facility. For Heinrich, it was not an intrusion, but an opportunity, a chance, to present his masterpiece to a discerning audience. They descended the spiral staircase not with trepidation, but with an air of bureaucratic entitlement. Their polished leather shoes and immaculate uniforms, a violent contrast to the grime and despair they entered. Led by a grim-faced Sturmbannführer, the group of 4 men moved through the chambers like museum patrons, their expressions a mixture of distaste and cold curiosity. They did not look at the prisoners in the cells. They looked at the infrastructure, the cleanliness of the stone floors, the organization of the tools. Heinrich greeted them not with subservience, but with the calm authority of a master of his domain. His own uniform pristine, his demeanor that of a senior academic welcoming colleagues to his laboratory. The tour was a masterpiece of clinical presentation. Heinrich did not showcase raw, screaming agony. That would have been vulgar and inefficient. Instead, he demonstrated his refinements. He showed them the calibrated rack, explaining the dial and its function in measuring tensile stress and pain thresholds with the dispassionate air of an engineer. He gestured to the organized logbooks, their pages filled with neat script and anatomical diagrams, testament to the scientific approach he had implemented. He pointed out the sterilized instruments, the improved sanitation protocols, the systematic filing of prisoner profiles. He spoke of enhanced interrogation yields, optimized subject viability, and psychological attrition rates. His language sanitized and technical, transforming horror into data. The officials listened, their initial distaste gradually replaced by nods of approval. They were men who appreciated order, efficiency, and results, and Heinrich was presenting them with a model of all three. One of them, an older man with the cold eyes of a lifelong administrator, paused before the new waterboarding apparatus. Heinrich explained its controlled pour, its focus on simulating drowning rather than causing it, and its value in extracting information while maintaining the subject's utility for further sessions. The official's lips pursed in something akin to professional admiration. "Remarkable Herr Doctor," the stern Banfer said, his voice echoing in the cold chamber. The old commandant was a butcher. "You have brought a necessary precision to the operation. The Reich appreciates such diligence. Your results are most impressive." The praise was delivered without a trace of irony, without any acknowledgement of the human cost behind the word results. It was a commendation of efficiency, of a job well done in the furtherance of state power. The officials concluded their tour in Heinrich's study, accepting small glasses of brandy without their hands trembling. They spoke of throughput and confession rates, of the value of such a facility in maintaining order. As they left, their polished shoes carrying them back to the world of light and power, they left behind a reinforced sense of purpose. Their visit had not been a condemnation. It had been a validation. The horror he had perfected was not only sanctioned, it was complimented, and Heinrich von Stahl stood in the renewed silence, the echo of their praise a colder and more potent fuel for his work than any prisoner's scream could ever be. The silence in the preparation chamber was a living thing, thick and anticipatory, broken only by the soft metallic click of instruments being laid out on a sterile tray. Heinrich von Stahl moved with a ritualistic precision, his focus absolute. Tonight was the culmination of weeks of observation, analysis, and refinement. Lisa vote. The defiant heart that had resisted every torment his science could devise would face his magnum opus method, engineered not to inflict pain, but to dismantle the very architecture of the self. He had named it the resonance chamber. It was not a device of blades or heat, but of sound and perception. Small, perfectly spherical room had been constructed deep within the most acoustically dead part of the dungeon, its walls lined with a strange, rubbery compound that absorbed all echo. Inside, Eliza was secured not by chains, but by a harness that held her suspended in the exact center of the void, her limbs gently restrained to minimize tactile sensation. She hung in absolute blackness, in a silence so profound it felt like pressure against the eardrums. Heinrich observed from an adjacent control room, his face illuminated by the soft glow of dials and switches on a custom-built console. This was his symphony, and he was its conductor. The first stage was absolute sensory deprivation, a refinement of his earlier methods. He allowed her to marinate in the nothingness until her own heartbeat became a thunderous drum in her skull, her breathing a hurricane. He monitored her vital signs through delicate sensors attached to her skin, watching for the familiar descent into disorientation. Then he introduced the sound. It was a single, pure tone, a frequency just at the lower threshold of human hearing. It was not loud, but in the absolute silence, it was immense. It vibrated not in the air, but in the bones, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to originate within her own teeth and spine. It offered no rhythm, no variation, only a constant, oppressive presence that scrambled coherent thought. He watched as her body, suspended in the harness, began to tense, her head turning minutely as if trying to locate the source of the internal vibration. After precisely 20 minutes, the tone ceased, plunging her back into the perfect silence, which now felt even more oppressive by contrast. Before her mind could reorient itself, Heinrich began the next phase. From hidden speakers, he played a recording, but it was no ordinary sound. It was a distorted, slowed-down loop of her own voice, captured during her earlier interrogations. Phrases of defiance, whispered pleas, even her own ragged breathing, were warped and layered over each other, creating a haunting, incomprehensible chorus of her own past suffering. It was a sound that was intimately hers, and yet utterly alien, a psychological mirror held up to a fractured mind. He varied the volume and distortion at random intervals, never allowing her brain to adapt. The harrowing soundtrack of her own dissolution was followed by bursts of blinding white light that flashed in perfect sync with a sudden, piercing high-frequency tone, overstimulating the visual and auditory cortex simultaneously. Then, back to the hum. Then, back to the distorted chorus. There was no pattern, no respite, only a relentless, senseless assault on every channel of perception. Heinrich monitored the readouts with rapt attention. Her heart rate was a frantic bird, beating against a cage of ribs. Her brainwave patterns showed states of extreme stress and confusion, flickering between waking terror and a trance-like state of overload. She was no longer reacting to pain. She was reacting to the systematic annihilation of her reality. The defiance that had defined her was being dissolved in an acid bath of curated sensation. Her identity stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but raw, unformed neurological response. This was not breaking a prisoner. This was unmaking a person. And in the cool glow of his console, Heinrich von Stahl watched the beautiful, terrible process of his most refined method yet, seeking the final, silent click of her utter dissolution. The resonance chamber had done its work with chilling efficiency. Elisa Vogt hung limp in her harness, a marionette with its strings cut, her body slick with a cold sweat that beaded and dripped into the sound-absorbent void below. The carefully orchestrated sensory assault had scoured her mind clean of coherent thought, leaving behind only a raw, bleeding plain of neurological static. Her eyes open and unblinking in the perfect blackness, saw nothing, registering only the phantom echoes of the distorted light that had seared her retinas. The warped recordings of her own voice still seemed to whisper in the bones of her skull, a ghostly cacophony that had replaced her inner monologue. She was, by every measurable metric, broken. The defiant architecture of her spirit lay in ruins, a city razed by the precise artillery of Heinrich's science. Heinrich observed the final readouts from his console, a cold wave of satisfaction washing over him. The heart rate had stabilized into a sluggish, depressed rhythm. The brainwaves showed the flat, exhausted lines of a system pushed to absolute collapse. The experiment was over. The variable had been resolved. He gave a curt nod, and the harness was winched down, lowering her inert form into the waiting arms of 2 guards. They carried her not to a cell, but back to the main interrogation chamber, laying her on the cold stone slab beneath the unwavering glare of the overhead lamp. Heinrich followed, his footsteps echoing in the sudden comparative noise of the normal dungeon. This was the moment of verification, the final, triumphant assessment of his absolute victory. He approached the slab, his shadow falling over her. He produced a small, precise pin. This was the classic neurological test, a final, simple confirmation of his total control. He would apply a sharp stimulus and observe the absence of any meaningful reaction, the final proof that the will had been extinguished. He took her hand, the one that had once been so strong and capable, now lying limp and pale on the stone. He positioned the point of the pin against the pad of her forefinger, ready to deliver the small, telling prick. And then it happened. Her fingers, which had been utterly slack, twitched. It was not a spasm of pain, but a deliberate, faint contraction. Her head, which had lolled to the side, turned slowly, painfully, until her clouded eyes found his. There was no recognition in them, no hatred, no fear. There was only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. But deep within that exhaustion, like a single, stubborn star in an otherwise empty sky, a light still flickered. It was not the blazing fire of her former defiance, but a faint, enduring ember that all his sophisticated torment had failed to extinguish. Her lips cracked and dry, parted. No sound came out at first, just a faint exhalation of air. Gott! Then a whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible, a breath shaped into a word that was not a plea, not a curse, but a simple, undeniable statement of being. No. The word hung in the lamplit air, a tiny, impossible thing. It had no force behind it, no volume. It was the ghost of a refusal, but a refusal nonetheless. It was not a victory. It was a persistence. She had nothing left, no strength, no hope, no sense of self. But somewhere in the ravaged landscape of her soul, a fundamental line had been drawn, and she had not crossed it. She had not broken. A tremor, fine and barely perceptible, passed through Heinrich's hand. The pin remained poised, unpricked. The cold satisfaction that had filled him moments before evaporated, replaced by a rising, icy tide of pure, unadulterated fury. His jaw tightened, the muscles standing out in sharp relief. His meticulously ordered world, built on the infallible logic of cause and effect, of stimulus and predictable response, shuddered on its axis. This was not an anomaly to be studied. It was an impossibility. It was a flaw in the universe itself. He had applied the ultimate pressure, and the diamond had not shattered. It had merely whispered its own name, stared down at her, at the ruin he had made of her, and saw not his masterpiece, but his failure. The ember in her eyes, though faint, seemed to mock the vast, terrible machinery of pain he had constructed. It defied quantification, measurement, understanding. With a sudden violent motion, he turned away from the slab, his gloved hand sweeping out and sending a tray of instruments clattering to the stone floor in a shocking crash of metal. The guards flinched, their eyes wide with alarm. They had never seen him lose his composure. They had never seen him express anything but cold control. He did not look at them. He stood with his back to Elisa, his shoulders rigid, his breath coming in short, controlled gusts through his nose. The fury was a white-hot core within him, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was deathly quiet, each word dripping with a venomous chill. Turn it to its cell. He did not wait for a response. He strode from the chamber, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that echoed through the dungeon like a gunshot. The sound of the slammed door was the only admission of defeat he would ever make. He had thrown the entirety of his science, his genius, his absolute authority, against the spirit of one woman, and she had not broken. She had merely whispered, and in that whisper she had wounded him more deeply than any weapon could. It began not with a scream, but with a cough-or-dry rattling sound that echoed with a new, insidious promise from a cell in the Western Bloc. The next day, a guard reported a feverish warmth from the same prisoner, his skin slick with an unnatural sweat that had nothing to do with the dungeon's perpetual chill. Within a week, the cough had become a chorus, a hacking, wet percussion that underscored the usual sounds of agony. And the first body was found stiff and cold at dawn, a blue tinge to the lips that spoke of lungs drowned from within. The illness, a brutal influenza that feasted on malnourishment and despair, had seeped into the stone, a plague born from the very conditions Heinrich had cultivated. He observed this spread with a cold, furious focus. This was not a variable he had introduced. It was an infection, an impurity in his controlled environment. Each feverish tremor, each ragged gasp, was not data but decay, a wasteful, random degradation of his precious research material. Prisoners were his instruments, to be worn down by measured application, not felled by some mindless biological chaos. The guards, too, began to succumb, their ranks thinning, their efficiency compromised by chills and fatigue. The dungeon's grim rhythm began to stutter, its carefully engineered symphony of suffering disrupted by the indiscriminate cacophony of disease. His response was swift and utterly devoid of compassion. The sick were not patients to be treated, they were contaminants to be isolated. He ordered the clearing of the oldest, most distant wing of the dungeon, a series of dripping, lightless cells that had been sealed for years. The ill were dragged from their current cells, their protests weak and choked by coughs, and thrown into this new pestilential ward. There were no physicians sent for, no medicines allocated. They were given the same meager rations, delivered with even less frequency by guards who wore cloths over their faces and handled the food with terrified haste. It was a quarantine of abandonment, a sentence of slow, solitary death meant not to heal, but to simply remove the infected variables from his equation. He increased the guards' rations of cheap schnapps, not as a comfort, but as a crude disinfectant and a means to ensure their continued function through fear and numbness. He had the ventilation shafts leading from the plague wing bricked up, sealing the miasma of sickness within its stone tomb. From his study, he could still hear the faint, muffled sounds of the dying, the weak coughing, the delirious mumblings, but he filtered them out as irrelevant noise. They were no longer subjects. They were statistical losses, a regrettable but necessary culling to protect the integrity of his remaining stock. The dungeon fever was a reminder that absolute control was an illusion, that chaos could always find a way in. And as Heinrich von Stahl listened to the distant dying sounds, his jaw was set, not in worry for the dying, but in cold anger at the interruption of his perfect, terrible work. The fever had receded, leaving behind a brittle silence and a palpable thinning of the dungeon's human stock. The culling had been efficient, a necessary pruning to preserve the whole, and order had been restored with an even colder, more rigid precision. Heinrich von Stahl, his fury at the interruption of his work and the inexplicable resilience of Eliza, Vogt still simmering beneath a veneer of absolute control, sought an outlet for his pent-up rigor. He required a method that was simple, direct, and utterly devoid of the frustrating variables of psychology or spirit. He required pure, quantifiable physical correction. He required the whip. The post was not a new installation, but an ancient, weathered piece of oak, dark and stained with the history of its purpose. Set firmly in the center of the punishment chamber, Heinrich had it sanded smooth, the better to observe the contrast of pale skin against dark wood. The whip he selected was his own design, a multi-tailed scourge, each tail tipped with a small, leaded knot designed not to slice, but to bruise deeply, to crush capillaries and raise welts that would throb for days. It was an instrument of blunt, pervasive agony, its effects measurable in the spectrum of bruising and the duration of soreness. The subject was a man caught stealing extra bread, crime of mundane desperation in a world defined by extraordinary suffering. He was secured to the post, his back exposed, his muscles taut with a fear that was refreshingly straightforward to Heinrich. There were no layers of defiance or faith to navigate here. It's only the simple, animal terror of impending pain. Heinrich dismissed the guards who had brought the man. This was not a demonstration, it was a calibration. He would conduct it himself. He uncoiled the whip, the leather tails slithering against the stone floor with a soft, sinister hiss. He took his position, his stance balanced and precise, a craftsman preparing his tool. The first stroke was not delivered with rage, but with a detached mechanical motion. His arm swung back, then forward in a tight, controlled arc. The tails snapped through the air, landing across the man's shoulders with a sound like a wet rope striking stone. A pattern of angry red lines bloomed instantly on the skin, the leaded knots leaving darker, already purpling circles at their centers. The man cried out, a sharp, guttural sound of pure shock. Heinrich did not hear the cry as an expression of suffering. He heard it as a data point, the first vocalization threshold. He waited exactly 10 seconds, allowing the pain to register fully, to seep into the nerves and announce its presence. Then came the second stroke, slightly lower, overlapping the first. Another cry, this one higher in pitch, more sustained. Heinrich noted it. He settled into a rhythm, a metronome of agony. Stroke. A 10-second pause for assessment. Stroke. Each impact was placed with methodical care, creating a latticework of pain that covered the man's back from shoulders to waist. He counted the lashes aloud, his voice a flat, dispassionate counterpoint to the prisoner's escalating screams. 3, thwack. 4, thwack. The numbers were not a taunt. They were a measure, a way to track the progression of the punishment and the subject's deteriorating tolerance. By the 15th lash, the cries had devolved into a continuous, ragged weeping. The man's body sagged against the post, held upright only by the restraints. His back was a single, massive, throbbing bruise, the skin a grotesque tapestry of crimson, purple, and blue. Heinrich paused, his arm momentarily still. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the damaged flesh with clinical interest. He noted the point at which the skin had begun to break in a few places, a fine trickle of blood mingling with sweat. He made a mental note. 20 lashes with this specific instrument appears to be the threshold for epidermal rupture in a subject of this nutritional status. He resumed. The counting continued. 16. The whip fell. The man's response was a weak, hiccuping moan. The pain had surpassed the point of sharp protest and entered a deeper, more profound realm of endurance. This was the phase that interested Heinrich most, the point where the body's responses became muted, where the nervous system began to short-circuit under the relentless barrage. He continued to the count of 25, then stopped. The subject was silent now, shuddering in waves of aftershock, his consciousness hovering on the edge of oblivion. Heinrich coiled the whip, the leather now warm from use. He observed the man for a full minute, timing his recovery, noting the rate of his breathing, the dilation of his pupils. The session was complete. The data was clear, the punishment administered with perfect, detached precision. He had not been angry, it had been exact. And as the guards returned to cut the limp form down from the post, Heinrich turned away, his mind already moving on to the next variable, the next equation, the next opportunity to assert his absolute, unfeeling control over the fragile, breakable world of flesh and bone. The directive arrived not with the morning post, but in the dead of night, carried by a grim-faced SS courier whose motorcycle exhaust echoed like a death rattle in the silent courtyard above. The envelope was thinner than the first that had summoned him, the paper cheaper, the typeface more hurried. But the eagle and swastika were the same, their impression in the black wax seal, a stark final command. Heinrich received it in his study, the single lamp illuminating his face, as he read the brief, brutal lines. The order was not a request for efficiency or a commendation of results. It was a demand for liquidation, its immediate effect. Interrogation and long-term study were to be secondary. The primary function of the Berlin dungeon was now execution. The pace was to be increased tenfold. Prisoners were to be processed and disposed of, their utility to the right concluded. A cold, unfamiliar sensation coiled in Heinrich's gut, not compassion, but a profound and searing frustration. It was the fury of a master craftsman ordered to use his finest tools for kindling. They were not just prisoners, they were his research material, each one a complex, irreplaceable repository of data on pain thresholds, psychological breaking points, and physiological endurance. The locksmith, whose fingers he had not yet fully mapped, the tailor whose ruined hands could still provide data on long-term nerve damage. Even the broken whispering form of Elisa Voce was his white whale, an unsolved equation that represented the outermost limit of his science. To simply put a bullet in their brains was not just wasteful, it was an act of vandalism. He found himself standing before the command was fully processed, the cheap paper crumpling slightly in his hand. The courier, expecting a swift acknowledgement, blinked in surprise as Heinrich's voice, usually a flat monotone, sharpened with an edge that was almost, but not quite, insubordination. "This is inefficient," he stated, the words cutting through the damp air of the study. He did not speak of morality or mercy. He framed his objection in the only language he knew, the language of his work. The subjects here represent months of calibrated study. Their continued viability is essential for refining our methods. To terminate them is to destroy a significant investment in the science of interrogation. The data they can still provide is invaluable. He spoke of them as assets, as living libraries of agony whose shelves had not yet been fully read. To execute them was to burn those libraries to the ground. He argued for their preservation not out of any concern for their lives, but out of a twisted, possessive reverence for the suffering he had inscribed upon them. They were his masterpiece, and this order was a demand to destroy the canvas. The cold fury in his eyes was not for the lives to be taken, but for the knowledge that would be lost, the perfect, terrible control that would be squandered in a moment of blunt, meaningless violence. The silence in his study was no longer a sanctuary of order, but a void that seemed to press in on him, heavy with the weight of impending chaos. The distant, rhythmic thump of artillery, a sound that had been a faint rumor for weeks, was now a constant, grinding tremor felt through the very stones of the dungeon. It was no longer the sound of the front, it was the sound of the end. A relentless drumbeat counting down the seconds until the world he had built in the dark was shattered by the world above. Heinrich von Stahl sat at his desk, the black journal open before him, the page blank but for the date. The pen in his hand felt unfamiliar, a weight he was no longer certain he could lift. For the first time since his descent into this kingdom of his own making, the precise machinery of his mind faltered. The screams from the corridors, which he had always filtered into data, now registered as what they were, animal terror, not of his design, but of a larger, more indiscriminate doom. The carefully calibrated agony he had authored was being drowned out by the crude, overwhelming agony of a city dying overhead. His control, so absolute within these walls, was revealed as a pathetic illusion, a sandcastle before an incoming tide. It was not a god, it was a man in a hole, and the hole was about to be filled in. He began to write a script, usually a model of impeccable precision, betraying a faint, almost imperceptible tremor. The words were not observations or data points. They were a confession, not of guilt, but of failure. He wrote of the reports, filtering down from the frantic officials above, of armies that were not advancing but collapsing, of streets that were no longer controlled but contested. The language of the Reich, once so certain and commanding, had become a frantic, contradictory babble of orders and counterorders. The war was not turning, it was ending, and it was ending in defeat. A cold, sickening fear, entirely alien to him, uncoiled in his stomach. It was not a fear of capture or punishment. Those were variables he could calculate, probabilities to be assessed. This was a profound, existential dread. It was the fear that his life's work, his grand, terrible symphony of suffering, had been for nothing. That the exquisite pain he had measured, the thresholds he had mapped, the souls he had unmade, would be rendered meaningless by the blunt, historical fact of failure. All his precision, his control, his godlike authority over this small, dark universe, it would be swept away into the ash heap of a lost cause, a forgotten footnote in a regime's disgrace. His legacy would not be one of feared mastery, but of monstrous irrelevance. The world was moving on, and it was leaving him and his dungeon behind, not as a monument, but as a sealed tomb. The pen scratched across the page, each word an admission of this terrifying final truth. His perfect control had always been contingent on a larger order that was now crumbling into dust. And in the dust, there was no data, only silence. The first tremor was a subtle thing, a deep, grumbling shudder that traveled up through the ancient foundations of the dungeon, a sensation felt in the bones long before it was heard by the ears. Dust, undisturbed for centuries, sifted down from the vaulted stone ceilings in fine, ghostly veils. In the cells, the perpetual chorus of moans and whimpers faltered, replaced by a sudden breathless silence as every prisoner, every guard, froze in place, their minds struggling to categorize this new and profound anomaly. It was not the sound of a door slamming or a tool falling. It was the sound of the world above coming apart. Then came the second impact, louder, closer, a thunderous concussion that slammed through the stone like the fist of a giant. A glass vial on Heinrich's desk trembled and toppled, shattering on the floor, its contents a dark stain seeping into the wood. The tremor was followed by a deep, rolling boom that seemed to go on forever, echoing through the labyrinthine corridors with a promise of utter devastation. The distant artillery barrages, a constant, ominous rumble for weeks, were no longer distant. They were here. Berlin was being methodically hammered into rubble, and the dungeon buried deep beneath its heart was feeling every blow. In the cells, a new sound began to rise, weaving itself through the silence left by the faded moans. It was not a sound of pain, but of something far more dangerous to the established order. Hope. A desperate, disbelieving hope, fragile and sharp as broken glass. Whispers, tentative at first, then gaining strength, slithered from behind iron bars. The Russians. The Americans. It didn't matter who. The sound was the sound of the walls cracking, not just of stone, but of power. For the first time in years, the immutable law of the dungeon that this was the end of the world, the final and only reality, was being challenged by the violence from above. The guards felt it too, but for them, the tremors bred a different kind of terror. Their rigid postures slackened, their eyes, usually cold with bored authority, darted toward the ceilings as if expecting the tons of rock above them to collapse at any moment. The fear was no longer of the doctor's displeasure. but of being buried alive in this tomb, of being trapped underground when the world above finally fell. The chain of command, so absolute and terrifying, felt suddenly fragile, a thin thread stretched to breaking point over a chasm of chaos. They looked at each other, and in their glances was a shared, unspoken question. Who was coming down those stairs next? And what would they do? Heinrich von Stahl stood motionless in the center of his study, the echoes of the blast slowly fading into a new, more profound silence. The fine layer of dust settling on his journal, on his instruments, on his own immaculate uniform, felt like a desecration. This was not data. This was not a variable to be controlled or measured. It was chaos, pure and mindless, an anti-force that sought to obliterate order rather than refine it. The carefully constructed world of his dominion, a universe of measured pain and absolute authority, was shaking itself to pieces. And for the first time, the master of the dungeon felt a tremor that had nothing to do with the earth, and everything to do with the terrifying, imminent end of his terrible, perfect reign. The tremors were no longer distant warnings. They were the dungeon's death throes, each concussive blast a hammer strike against the foundations of Heinrich's world. The electric lights flickered wildly, casting frantic, stuttering shadows that danced like demons on the shuddering walls, before plunging everything into an emergency-lit gloom. The air, always stale, now tasted of powdered stone and the acrid temps of high explosives filtering down from the world above. The orderly silence of terror was gone, replaced by a rising cacophony of panic, the shouts of guards, the frantic beating on cell doors, the raw, hopeful cries of prisoners who sensed the approaching end of their long night. Heinrich's mind, a fortress of cold logic, was under siege. The meticulously ordered files in his study, the journals filled with a lifetime of calculated agony, were now just paper useless. Fragile things in the face of the crude, overwhelming violence from above, his first instinctive thought was not for escape, but for preservation. This data was his legacy, the only proof of his terrible genius. He moved with a frantic, uncharacteristic haste, sweeping armfuls of files into a large metal disposal bin kept for ash and waste. He grabbed a can of lamp oil, its smell sharp and pungent, and doused the papers. The liquid soaking into the pages, drowning the precise script that had chronicled so much suffering. A match flared in his trembling hand, its small defiant flame the only point of warmth in the chilling chaos. He dropped it into the bin. Hungry orange fire roared to life, consuming the names, the numbers, the maps of broken spirits. The light of the flames flickered across his face, which was no longer a mask of calm authority, but a rigid portrait of suppressed fury and despair. He watched his life's work turn to ash, each curling black page a tiny funeral pyre for his own relevance. The knowledge that the advancing enemy would pore over his notes, judge his methods, was an intolerable violation. Better oblivion. The sound of booted feet, not the familiar measured tread of his guards, but the heavy, rushing stomp of combat troops echoed down the main corridor, growing louder, closer. Shouts in a harsh foreign language mixed with the sharp, definitive reports of gunfire. The screams that followed were not of pain inflicted under controlled conditions, but the raw, chaotic sounds of a fortress being stormed. His escape route, a little-used service tunnel that led to a sewer access point, was his only gambit. He abandoned the burning bin and fled his study, his polished boots slipping on the dust-covered stones. The corridor was a nightmare of confusion, guards throwing down their weapons, prisoners reaching through bars with desperate, grasping hands. He paid them no heed, his singular focus on the iron door at the end of the passage. He reached it, fumbling with the heavy key. It turned with a shriek of protesting metal. He shoved the door open, and a wave of frigid, foul-smelling air washed over him. The tunnel beyond was pitch black, a mouth of absolute darkness. He took one step into it, then two. A deafening blast from behind him threw him forward. The concussion was immense, a wave of force that slammed the iron door shut with a final cataclysmic shriek of twisting metal, sealing it irrevocably. The explosion, likely a satchel charge meant to clear a barricade, had collapsed the entire section of the corridor behind him. Dust billowed around him, choking and thick. The sounds of battle were suddenly muffled, replaced by the groan of shifting stone and the trickle of falling debris. He was not free. He was entombed. The way forward was blackness. The way back was sealed behind tons of rubble. The advancing forces had not captured him. They had accidentally buried him. Heinrich von Stahl, the master of the Berlin dungeon, was trapped in its deepest, darkest belly. A rat in its own sinking ship. The absolute control he had wielded over thousands had been reduced to the few cubic feet of damp, dark air in a collapsed tunnel. The silence that descended was not his own. It was the silence of the grave he had built for others, now closing in around him. The first thing that struck the liberating soldiers was the silence. It was not an empty quiet, but a heavy, saturated stillness. As if the very air had been thickened by the weight of the screams. It had absorbed and could now no longer hold. The dust of the final assault still hung in the corridors, boats dancing in the beams of their flashlights, illuminating a world frozen in its final, terrible moment. Cell doors stood agape, swung open not with hope, but with the frantic energy of men who knew their time was measured in seconds. The instruments of Pain the Rack, the Iron Maiden, the whipping post, stood idle. Their cold iron and stained wood looking like exhibits in some abandoned museum of the damned. They moved through the chambers with a grim professional caution, their boots crunching on shattered glass and fallen stone. The few prisoners they found were not jubilant. They were ghosts, hollowed-out creatures who stared from the shadows with eyes that had seen too much to comprehend freedom. They huddled in corners or lay on bare stone, too weak to stand, their liberation a concept too vast for their shrunken worlds to hold. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones, their voices swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere, their offers of help met with blank stares or slow, trembling gestures. The dungeon had been liberated, but the horror remained, seeping from the stones like a miasma. In the days that followed, as medics tended to the survivors and the grim task of cataloging the dead began, the stories started to emerge. They were not told in coherent narratives, but in fragments, whispered between feverish bouts of coughing or murmured in the throes of nightmare. They spoke of the cold, the hunger, the relentless drip of water. But more than anything, they spoke of the doctor. They did not use his name. To them, he was never a man but a force, an embodiment of the calculated cruelty that had governed their existence. They spoke of his silence, his calm, his eyes that held no more emotion than the polished steel of his tools. They described methods that sounded less like torture and more like a terrible, precise science, the measured turn of a screw, the timed application of cold, the psychological dismantling in lightless cells. His legacy was not written in the bodies of the broken, though there were plenty of those. It was etched into the vacant stares of the survivors, in the way they flinched at the sound of a dropped tool and the terror that crossed their faces at the sight of a man in any kind of uniform. It lingered in the empty chambers, where the absence of sound seemed to echo more loudly than any scream. The instruments could be carted away, the cells could be scrubbed clean, but the memory of his presence, the chilling certainty of his control, the absolute erasure of mercy remained, a stain on the very soul of the place. The dungeon was free, but it was not cleansed. The silence after was filled with the ghost of his work, a perpetual aching reminder of the pain that had been authored there. A pain so refined and absolute it had outlived its creator,